Hey guys, tonight we're talking about how two Stanford design students tried to save the world from cigarettes and accidentally created the largest youth nicotine epidemic in American history. A sleek USB-shaped device that promised harm reduction delivered more nicotine to teenage brains than Marlboro ever dreamed possible. The product designed to help 45-year-old smokers quit became the must-have accessory for 15-year-olds who'd never touched a cigarette. Within 3 years, one company reversed 2 decades of declining youth tobacco use and made its founders billionaires in the process. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support, we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. To understand how Juul conquered teenage America, you first need to understand 2 graduate students watching their professors die. Adam Bowen and James Monsees met at Stanford's design program in 2004. Both smokers themselves, both surrounded by brilliant academics coughing their way through lectures. The irony wasn't lost on them. People smart enough to engineer revolutionary technology couldn't quit a habit invented in the 1800s. Cigarettes killed 480,000 Americans annually, yet smokers kept lighting up despite knowing the consequences. Nicotine itself wasn't particularly deadly compared to the tar and combustion byproducts. The addiction kept people burning tobacco, inhaling 7,000 chemicals with each drag. Bowen and Monsees saw a design problem. Nicotine replacement therapies failed because patches delivered the drug too slowly, gum tasted horrible, and neither replicated the ritual of smoking. E-cigarettes existed since the early 2000s, but they were garbage. Weak nicotine delivery, harsh vapor, they looked like plastic toys. Smokers tried them and went straight back to Marlboros. The Stanford duo spent their thesis work prototyping alternatives, building device after device in workshops and apartments. Their early designs resembled fountain pens, cigarette holders, minimalist tubes that bore no resemblance to traditional smokes. The breakthrough came from chemistry, not design. Traditional e-cigarettes used freebase nicotine, the same form found in cigarettes, which required high temperatures to vaporize and produced harsh, throat-burning vapor at effective doses. Bowen and Monsees discovered that adding benzoic acid to nicotine created a salt formulation that could deliver massive doses smoothly. The science wasn't new. Philip Morris had experimented with nicotine salts in the 1960s, but never commercialized the research. The Stanford graduates refined the formula, testing pH levels and acid ratios until they achieved something remarkable. Vapor you could inhale deeply without coughing, carrying nicotine concentrations that would make a traditional e-cigarette user gag. They filed patents in 2007. The chemistry allowed for 59 milligrams of nicotine per milliliter of liquid, 5 times stronger than standard e-cigarettes. 1 milliliter pod delivered roughly the same nicotine as an entire pack of Marlboro Reds. Users wouldn't need to puff constantly like previous devices required. 3 or 4 deep inhales would satisfy a craving equivalent to smoking a cigarette. The efficiency was staggering, the delivery method unprecedented. Investors initially dismissed them. The e-cigarette market was flooded with cheap Chinese imports that didn't work. Venture capitalists saw another gadget doomed to fail. But Bowen and Monsees persisted, securing initial funding from friends and family, then convincing Silicon Valley firms that they'd solve the fundamental problem, replicating the pharmacological experience of smoking without combustion. By 2015, they'd raised over $100 million. Their company, originally called Plume, rebranded to Pax Labs, then spun off the device that would change everything as Juul Labs. The device itself looked nothing like a cigarette deliberately. Rectangular, sleek. It resembled a USB flash drive more than a tobacco product. Charging happened via magnetic connection to a laptop. Pods clicked into place with satisfying precision. The aesthetic screamed Apple Store, not gas station. This was intentional. Dissociate from smoking stigma. Embrace tech culture's clean minimalism. Available in silver and slate grey, the device weighed less than an ounce. You could palm it completely, hide it in a closed fist. Beta testing in 2015 revealed something both promising and disturbing. Adult smokers who tried Juul reported finally finding an alternative that worked. The throat hit matched cigarettes. The nicotine satisfaction arrived within seconds. The ritual felt right. Testimonials poured in from people who'd failed to quit for decades. But the beta testers also included some younger users, friends of friends, people in their 20s, and their usage patterns differed dramatically. While 40-year-old smokers replaced cigarettes one-to-one, younger users consumed pods at alarming rates, going through multiple pods in days. The company ignored the warning signs. Launch happened in June 2015 at $49.99 per starter kit. Marketing targeted adult smokers exclusively, showing people in their 30s and 40s, emphasizing smoking cessation. Early advertisements featured testimonials from ex-smokers, clinical language about harm reduction, comparisons to nicotine patches and gum. Juul positioned itself as a public health tool, a technological solution to a century-old problem. The FDA regulated e-cigarettes loosely at this point. They existed in a grey zone, not quite tobacco products, not quite medical devices. Initial sales focused on vape shops and specialty retailers. 8 flavors launched: Virginia tobacco, classic tobacco, mint, menthol, fruit, creme brulee, cool cucumber, and mango. The tobacco flavors targeted former smokers seeking familiar tastes. The fruit and dessert flavors, the company claimed, helped smokers transition away from tobacco associations. Mango became unexpectedly popular. Sweet, smooth, it bore no resemblance to cigarette flavor whatsoever. Cool cucumber attracted attention for its weirdness. Mint outsold menthol 3-1. By late 2015, Juul sales remained modest but steady. The company projected gradual growth in the adult smoking cessation market. Internal projections estimated perhaps 5 to 10% of American smokers might switch over 5 years. That would mean millions in revenue, a successful niche product, vindication of Bowen and Monsi's decade-long quest. They gave interviews to tech publications, explaining the chemistry, emphasizing the harm reduction mission. They genuinely believed they'd created something positive. Then high schools discovered Juul, and everything changed in ways the founders never anticipated, or claimed they never anticipated. The device designed for 45-year-old chain smokers became the obsession of 15-year-olds who'd never touched tobacco. The smooth nicotine salts that helped adults quit cigarettes introduced adolescent brains to addiction levels previously impossible with traditional e-cigarettes. The USB form factor that appealed to tech-savvy adults made the device perfectly concealable in teenage hands. Mango flavor, meant to ease adult smokers away from tobacco taste, became the gateway for kids who'd never have tolerated harsh cigarette smoke. By mid-2016, YouTube videos appeared showing teenagers demonstrating Juul tricks. School bathroom traffic patterns shifted. Principals started finding unfamiliar devices in students' backpacks. Parents discovered pods and assumed they were computer accessories. The epidemic was beginning, but mainstream media hadn't noticed yet. Juul's sales started climbing faster than projections predicted. The company celebrated without asking why their growth suddenly accelerated. In executive meetings, revenue graphs pointed skyward. Nobody wanted to examine what demographic was driving those numbers. The chemistry that made Juul successful in adults made it catastrophic in teenagers. Adolescent brains respond to nicotine differently than mature brains. Addiction establishes faster, withdrawal hits harder, long-term dependency becomes nearly inevitable. The smooth delivery meant kids experienced no natural deterrent, no harsh coughing that historically limited youth smoking experimentation. They inhaled deeply, repeatedly, consuming nicotine doses that would have made a first-time cigarette smoker violently ill. The benzoic acid formula had eliminated the body's defense mechanism. Bowen and Monsees had created the perfect addiction delivery system and handed it to the most vulnerable population. Whether through negligence, willful blindness, or genuine surprise, they'd unleashed something they couldn't control. The promise of saving adult smokers was about to be overshadowed by the reality of addicting millions of children. The device charged via USB port. Students plugged it into school computers. Teachers walked past classrooms where teenagers were literally recharging their nicotine delivery systems between classes. The invasion had begun, and nobody in authority even recognized what was happening yet. The molecular difference between Juul and every e-cigarette before it came down to a single chemical compound, benzoic acid, common in food preservatives, changed nicotine's entire personality when combined correctly. Traditional e-cigarettes vaporized freebase nicotine at pH levels around 8 or 9, creating alkaline vapor that burned throats and triggered coughing reflexes. Juul's formulation dropped the pH to approximately 5 by adding precise ratios of benzoic acid, creating protonated nicotine salts that slipped past throat defenses like smoke through a screen door. The chemistry mirrored crack cocaine's relationship to powder cocaine. Both delivered the same drug, but the delivery method transformed everything. Crack vaporized at lower temperatures, entered bloodstreams faster, hit brains harder. Nicotine salts worked identically. Lower vaporization temperature, faster absorption through lung tissue, more rapid crossing of the blood-brain barrier. Within 10 seconds of inhaling Juul vapor, nicotine concentrations in blood plasma spiked to levels matching or exceeding cigarette smoking. The smoothness of the hit disguised the intensity completely. Bowen and Monsees understood this pharmacology perfectly. Patent applications filed between 2007 and 2014 explicitly described achieving satisfaction comparable to traditional cigarettes through nicotine salt formulations. They tested dozens of acids, citric, lactic, tartaric, before settling on benzoic acid as optimal. The patents detailed exact pH ranges, specific molar ratios, vaporization temperatures down to precise degrees. This wasn't accidental discovery. This was engineered addiction delivery. Philip Morris scientists had walked this path decades earlier. Internal tobacco industry documents from the 1960s, released through litigation in the 1990s, showed extensive research into nicotine salts and pH manipulation. R.J. Reynolds experimented with ammonia compounds to increase nicotine's kick. Brown and Williamson studied acids to smooth harshness. The tobacco giants understood that controlling nicotine delivery meant controlling addiction, which meant controlling customers for life. They'd shelved the research after determining that modified cigarettes might attract regulatory attention or admission of manipulation. Juul resurrected this science under the banner of harm reduction. Each pod contained 0.7 milliliters of liquid at 59 milligrams per milliliter concentration, totaling roughly 41 milligrams of nicotine. A Marlboro Red cigarette contained about 12 milligrams of nicotine, though smokers absorbed only 1–2 milligrams per cigarette. Juul users absorbed significantly higher percentages due to the salt formulation's efficiency. Estimates range from 50–75% bioavailability. The math was brutal. One pod delivered nicotine equivalent to 20–30 cigarettes worth of absorbed drug. Most users had no idea. packaging didn't clearly state cigarette equivalency. The word pod sounded innocuous, technical, nowhere near as threatening as pack. Teenagers went through pods like candy, consuming what would have been cartons of cigarettes weekly. Their developing brains received nicotine floods that rewired reward circuits permanently. Dopamine responses established new baselines. Receptor density increased. Tolerance built rapidly, demanding higher and more frequent doses. The company launched nationally in June 2015 with minimal fanfare. Starter packs included the device and 4 pods for $49.90. Replacement 4-packs cost $15.90. The pricing positioned Juul slightly cheaper than cigarettes in most markets. A pack-a-day smoker spent roughly $200 monthly, while equivalent Juul usage ran $120–150. Adult smokers appreciated the savings. Teenage users, however, weren't replacing existing cigarette habits. They were establishing entirely new nicotine dependencies that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Marketing materials showed diverse adults in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. One early advertisement featured a 42-year-old teacher explaining how Juul helped her quit after 20 years of smoking. Another showed a construction worker, a nurse, a small business owner. Responsible adults making health-conscious choices. The aesthetic was clean, medical almost, emphasizing switching rather than starting. Juul carefully avoided any imagery that might appeal to youth. No parties, no concerts, no rebellious undertones. At least in official materials. Launch events told a different story. In summer 2015, Juul hosted parties in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami to introduce the device to influencers and early adopters. The venues were nightclubs and rooftop bars. The attendees skewed young, predominantly 20s and early 30s. Models distributed free devices and pods. DJs played while guests vaped, photographed themselves, posted to Instagram with branded hashtags. The company later claimed these events targeted young adults aged 21–35 trying to quit smoking, but photos from the parties showed few people who looked over 30. The flavors became Juul's secret weapon and eventual downfall. Virginia tobacco and classic tobacco tasted medicinal, vaguely like actual cigarettes, appealing to middle-aged smokers seeking familiarity. Mint and menthol attracted former menthol cigarette smokers, but mango, fruit, creme brulee, and cool cucumber had zero connection to tobacco products. They tasted like desserts, tropical vacations, spa water. Adult smokers trying to quit sometimes appreciated the departure from tobacco flavor, but these options proved irresistible to teenagers who'd never have tolerated cigarette taste. Mango dominated sales within months. Sweet, smooth, reminiscent of candy, it bore no harshness whatsoever. Users described it as delicious, addictive, impossible to put down. The flavor masked nicotine's naturally bitter taste completely. First-time users, including teenagers experimenting, experienced no unpleasant sensations to deter continued use. Traditional cigarettes tasted awful initially, creating a barrier to addiction that filtered out many potential smokers. Mango Juul eliminated that barrier entirely. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. By late 2015, sales patterns revealed something corporate leadership chose not to investigate. Mango and mint pods outsold tobacco flavors 3-to-1 in certain zip codes, specifically zip codes containing high schools and colleges. Convenience stores near educational institutions couldn't keep inventory stocked. Gas stations in suburban areas frequented by teenagers saw Juul products flying off shelves. Meanwhile, stores in retirement communities or older demographic areas showed modest, steady sales. The data screamed youth adoption, but Juul's executives maintained public ignorance. Internal emails from 2016, later released through litigation, showed sales teams celebrating growth without questioning its source. One executive wrote about being surprised and thrilled by demand in college towns. Another mentioned expanding retail presence near universities to capitalize on unexpected market enthusiasm. Nobody asked why 19-year-olds were buying a smoking cessation device when they'd never smoked. Nicotine metabolism differs drastically between adolescents and adults. Teenage livers process the drug more slowly, leading to longer-lasting effects and more severe withdrawal symptoms. The half-life of nicotine in a 16-year-old's body exceeds that of a 40-year-old by approximately 30%. This meant teenage Juul users stayed high longer, crashed harder, and needed their next dose more desperately. The addiction cycle established faster and deeper than in adult brains. Neuroscience research from the early 2000s had already established that nicotine exposure during adolescence caused permanent changes to prefrontal cortex development. The brain regions controlling impulse regulation, decision-making, and future planning were still forming through age 25. Introducing nicotine during this critical window didn't just create addiction, it fundamentally altered brain architecture. Studies on teenage smokers showed increased rates of depression, anxiety, and attention disorders compared to non-smokers, even when controlling for other variables. Juul's smooth delivery compounded these neurological dangers. Traditional cigarettes' harshness meant most teenage experimenters coughed, felt sick, and tried only a few cigarettes before either quitting or gradually building tolerance over months. This slow ramp gave some teenagers opportunities to quit before addiction solidified. Juul users inhaled deeply from their first puff, receiving full nicotine doses immediately, establishing dependency within days or weeks rather than months. The company's harm reduction argument rested entirely on the assumption that users were replacing cigarettes, not initiating nicotine use. For adult smokers, this math worked. Fewer carcinogens from combustion meant reduced cancer and respiratory disease risks, even if nicotine addiction continued. But for teenagers starting nicotine through Juul, no harm reduction existed. They went from zero baseline risk to significant addiction and unknown long-term consequences from inhaling vaporized chemicals. Laboratory analysis of Juul vapor revealed disturbing compounds beyond nicotine and benzoic acid. Glycerol and propylene glycol, the base liquids in e-cigarettes, broke down under heat into formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, and acrolein. These chemicals cause cellular damage, inflammation, and potentially cancer with chronic exposure. Flavoring chemicals like diacetyl, used in creme brulee pods, were linked to serious lung disease in workers who'd inhaled them industrially. The long-term health effects of daily inhalation remained unknown in 2015 because the delivery system was too new for epidemiological studies. Juul's own testing showed the device heated liquid to approximately 200–250 degrees Celsius. At these temperatures, chemical reactions occurred that weren't fully understood. The company submitted limited safety data to the FDA, arguing that existing e-cigarette research applied to their product. But nicotine concentration 5 times higher than competitors meant Juul users inhaled more of everything: more nicotine, more flavoring chemicals, more thermal degradation products. The dose made the poison, and Juul delivered unprecedented doses. By December 2015, 6 months post-launch, sales exceeded internal projections by 40%. Corporate email celebrated the viral adoption and organic growth without examining what viral meant in practice. Word of mouth drove sales, particularly among younger demographics. The device's design made it Instagram ready. The vapor was subtle enough for indoor use. The flavors encouraged social sharing, friends passing devices, trying different pods, comparing favorites. This social transmission pattern resembled youth smoking adoption from the 1950s-1990s, when cigarette companies understood that peer pressure sold better than advertising. The USB form factor proved catastrophically perfect for teenage concealment. Traditional e-cigarettes looked like cigarettes or pens, recognizable, suspicious when pulled from pockets. Juul looked like something that belonged near a computer. Students carried them openly. Teachers who noticed assumed they were flash drives. Parents finding them in rooms thought they were school supplies. The device charged via computer USB ports, giving teenagers legitimate reasons to have them connected to laptops. The plausible deniability was built into the design. Juul Labs maintained that adult aesthetics drove the design choices, not youth appeal. The company pointed to sleek Apple products, minimalist design trends in tech, the professional appearance that would make smokers comfortable using the device at work. But the practical result was a nicotine delivery system optimized for teenage concealment and use. Whether intentional or not, Bowen and Monsees had created the perfect high school contraband. Powerful, discreet, shareable, and completely legal for adults to purchase and provide to minors in many jurisdictions. The chemistry of addiction was spreading through American high schools, and the epidemic was still invisible to parents, educators, and public health officials. Sales charts showed exponential growth curves. Teenage brains were developing permanent dependencies, and in Juul's San Francisco headquarters, executives watched revenue numbers climb while maintaining carefully crafted ignorance about who was driving them. The transformation of American high schools began quietly in fall 2016. Students at a Connecticut prep school discovered Juul devices could be used during class without detection. The vapor dissipated within seconds, nearly odorless, invisible against white walls. One student exhaled into a sweatshirt sleeve during a chemistry exam. Another took hits while the teacher wrote on the blackboard. Word spread through text messages, then to neighboring schools, then across state lines through social media networks that moved faster than any adult awareness. Bathroom stalls became vaping lounges within weeks. Groups of students gathered between classes, passing devices, taking pulls, discussing flavors like sommeliers comparing wines. The Juul room replaced the smoking area that had disappeared from school grounds decades earlier, except this happened indoors during school hours, with teachers walking past completely oblivious. The vapor vanished before anyone could identify its source. YouTube tutorials multiplied exponentially through late 2016. How to hit a Juul in class without getting caught accumulated millions of views. Videos demonstrated the ghost inhale, holding vapor in lungs until nothing exhaled. The French inhale, blowing O-rings, tornado tricks traditionally done with cigarette smoke now performed with fruit-flavored vapor. Comment sections filled with teenagers sharing tips, exhale into backpacks, blow into water bottles, used during passing periods when hallways were crowded. Mango pods became currency in high school economics. Seniors with cars could buy legally in some states, or convince older siblings to purchase. They sold individual pods for $8–10 to underclassmen, doubling their investment. A single 4-pack generated $30 profit. Some students ran operations moving 20–30 packs weekly through their schools. The profit margins rivaled small-time drug dealing, but Juul pods weren't illegal, just age-restricted. Teachers began finding unfamiliar rectangular devices in confiscated items by winter 2016. Most had no idea what they were looking at. The devices bore no obvious tobacco branding, no cigarette-like appearance, no smell that triggered recognition. One principal in Ohio collected a dozen devices before a student finally explained what they were. Another administrator in California assumed they were new phone accessories. The generational technology gap created a surveillance blind spot that students exploited ruthlessly. Parents discovered pods in laundry and threw them away thinking they were trash. The small plastic cartridges resembled nothing familiar, not cigarette packs, not drug paraphernalia parents remembered from their own youth. The packaging was minimal, clinical, featuring only small text about nicotine content that few bothered reading. One mother in New Jersey found her daughter's stash of 30 pods and assumed they were samples from a cosmetics store. The mathematics of teenage consumption became truly frightening by early 2017. Heavy adult smokers consumed perhaps 20-30 cigarettes daily, representing severe addiction. Teenage Juul users were blowing through pods at rates suggesting even higher nicotine intake. One pod equaled roughly a pack of cigarettes in nicotine content. Students consuming 2 or 3 pods daily were effectively chain-smoking 40 to 60 cigarettes worth of nicotine. Their developing brains had never encountered such chemical bombardment. Withdrawal symptoms appeared within hours of the last hit. Students reported inability to concentrate during morning classes before finding opportunities to vape, irritability, anxiety, physical restlessness, headaches. Classic nicotine withdrawal presented in 15-year-olds who'd been using Juul for only months. Some students woke up at night craving nicotine. Others hit their devices before getting out of bed each morning. The addiction had hooked deeper and faster than cigarettes ever could have. Social media documentation of the epidemic provided a real-time record adults weren't monitoring. Instagram accounts dedicated to vaping accumulated hundreds of thousands of followers. The hashtag #DoItForJuul trended repeatedly, featuring videos of teenagers taking massive hits, performing tricks, showing off pod collections. Students photographed their devices in class, at lunch, during sports practices. The documentation was public, searchable, undeniable, and completely ignored by those in positions to intervene. High school culture absorbed vaping into its social fabric with shocking speed. Owning a Juul signaled status in certain groups. Mango users formed tribes distinct from mint users. Sharing pods created bonds similar to sharing cigarettes in previous generations, but happening younger and faster. Freshmen who'd never have tried cigarettes were juuling within weeks of starting high school. The cool factor that tobacco companies had spent billions cultivating for cigarettes now attached itself organically to Juul. Regional variations emerged in adoption patterns. Wealthy suburban schools saw higher usage rates than urban schools initially, likely due to disposable income required for consistent pod purchases. Private schools reported epidemic-level problems before public schools. Coastal areas led interior regions. But by mid-2017, the spread had reached nearly every demographic and geography. Rural Montana schools reported problems. Inner-city Philadelphia schools installed detectors. The invasion was complete and national. Juul's sales figures for 2017 told the story corporate communications refused to acknowledge. Revenue increased 400% year over year, reaching roughly $224 million. Market share among e-cigarette brands jumped from 13% to 40% in 12 months. The company wasn't just growing, it was achieving monopolistic dominance through youth adoption, even as official messaging insisted they targeted adult smokers exclusively. Retail expansion followed demand with predatory precision. Juul products appeared in gas stations, convenience stores, and vape shops near schools nationwide. Marketing materials instructed retailers to place devices near checkout counters at eye level. Point-of-sale displays featured bright colors and sleek imagery. While Juul avoided traditional advertising to youth, their retail strategy ensured maximum visibility to anyone buying snacks, drinks, or magazines, including teenagers. Internal company emails from 2017 later obtained through litigation, revealed awareness that couldn't be dismissed as accidental. One sales representative reported that stores near high schools were killing it, with Juul sales. Another mentioned that college bookstores requested inventory increases before fall semester. A marketing analyst noted that social media engagement was overwhelmingly young, but suggested this meant they were reaching 21 to 24-year-olds trying to quit smoking. The willful blindness was documented in writing. Stanford researchers began noticing something alarming in early 2017. The same university where Bowen and Monsis had developed Juul was now seeing unprecedented nicotine use among undergraduates who'd never smoked cigarettes. A survey found that 18% of freshmen reported vaping regularly, compared to historical smoking rates around 8% in previous freshman classes. The numbers suggested not substitution, but expansion. Vaping was creating nicotine users who wouldn't have existed otherwise. Convenience store owners watched the phenomenon with mixed feelings. Sales were incredible, margins were good, but the customer base was obviously problematic. One owner in Wisconsin reported teenagers coming in groups asking for specific flavors, paying with crumpled small bills, clearly underage but showing fake IDs. Another in Texas noticed students arriving during lunch breaks from a nearby high school. The legal responsibility fell on retailers to verify age, but enforcement was inconsistent and prosecution rare. Emergency rooms began receiving cases of acute nicotine poisoning in teenagers by spring 2017. Symptoms included rapid heartbeat, elevated blood pressure, nausea, vomiting, and in severe cases, seizures. One 14-year-old in Michigan was hospitalized after consuming 3 pods in a single evening, attempting to show off to friends. A 16-year-old in Florida experienced a cardiac event after mixing Juul use with energy drinks. Poison control centers fielded increasing calls from parents who'd found their children sick and lethargic after vaping sessions. The device's design continued enabling concealment in absurd ways. Students vaped during standardized tests, tucking devices into long sleeves and taking hits while pretending to think. Athletes used them in locker rooms minutes before games, seeking nicotine hits for performance anxiety. One student in Oregon was caught vaping inside a bathroom stall during a lockdown drill. The addiction was strong enough to override basic survival instincts. School administrators who recognized the problem faced enforcement nightmares. Traditional smoking violations involved obvious evidence: smell, smoke, cigarette butts. Vaping left almost nothing. Without physical evidence or witnesses, disciplining students became legally complicated. Some schools installed expensive sensors that could detect vapor chemicals, but students quickly learned to defeat them by exhaling into bags or bottles. The technological arms race favored the users. Parental awareness lagged dangerously behind reality. Most parents in 2017 remained completely ignorant that a youth nicotine epidemic was occurring. Those who'd fought to keep their teenagers away from cigarettes didn't recognize that Juul represented a more insidious threat. The harm reduction messaging confused parents who did learn about vaping. If it helped adults quit smoking, how dangerous could it be? The answer was catastrophically dangerous when the users were children who'd never smoked. Underground markets developed at schools for students without access to legal purchase points. Some teenagers ordered devices and pods online using prepaid cards, exploiting weak age verification systems. Others convinced homeless people outside convenience stores to buy for them in exchange for cash tips. The determination to acquire nicotine matched patterns seen in serious drug addiction, except the addicts were 14-year-olds dependent on a substance marketed as a smoking cessation tool. Juul Labs released no public statements acknowledging youth usage throughout 2017. The company maintained focus on adult smoking cessation in press releases, investor presentations, and the limited media interviews granted. When questioned about reports of teenage use, spokespeople emphasized that their products were only for adult smokers 21 and older. They blamed retailers for illegal sales. They suggested that youth vaping was a broader industry problem, not specific to Juul. The deflections were professional and completely dishonest. By December 2017, the invasion was complete, but still largely invisible to mainstream consciousness. Parents, educators, and public health officials remained mostly unaware that nicotine use among high schoolers had reversed decades of decline. Juul's valuation approached $2 billion based on explosive sales growth. Teenagers across America were chemically dependent on a device that didn't exist 3 years earlier. The epidemic had established itself before anyone in authority recognized it was happening, and the worst was still to come. Cultural penetration happened without Juul spending $1 on traditional advertising. The company never bought television commercials, never placed magazine ads targeting youth, never sponsored music festivals or sporting events that cigarette makers had once dominated. Instead, the product marketed itself through the most powerful force in teenage culture: social proof from peers who made nicotine addiction look effortlessly cool. Instagram influencers discovered Juul organically in late 2016 and early 2017. Lifestyle bloggers photographed devices alongside lattes and laptops, framing vaping as sophisticated adult behavior. Fitness personalities claimed Juul helped them quit cigarettes while maintaining physiques. Beauty influencers included devices in "What's in my bag" videos without disclosing any relationship with the company. The marketing was invisible precisely because it wasn't official marketing, just organic adoption by people whose audiences skewed young and impressionable. Rappers began name-dropping Juul in lyrics by mid-2017. Lil Yachty referenced hitting a Juul in a track. Travis Scott was photographed with a device. SoundCloud rappers mentioned mango pods in songs that accumulated millions of streams. The hip-hop endorsement carried weight among teenage audiences who'd grown up watching cigarette smoking decline in music videos. Juul represented something new, technological, divorced from tobacco's stigma, while delivering the same rebellious chemical hit. The hashtag #EJaDoItForJuul became a rallying cry across social platforms. Videos showed teenagers taking enormous hits and holding vapor for impossible durations. Challenges emerged. Who could exhale the biggest cloud? Who could ghost a hit most completely? Who could vape in the most brazen location? One video showed a student hitting a Juul while a teacher stood 3 feet away. Another featured vaping during a church service. The content was rebellious theatre, documenting addiction as performance art. High school bathrooms earned new names by late 2017. Students called them Juul rooms, so universally that the term appeared in school newspapers and student government discussions. Lines formed outside stalls not for biological necessities, but for nicotine hits between classes. Students would ask going to the Juul room instead of going to the bathroom. The linguistic shift revealed how thoroughly vaping had infiltrated daily school life. Elaborate hand signals developed for communicating about Juul use without verbal detection. Holding up 4 fingers meant I need pods. Tapping 2 fingers on a desk signaled, "Can I borrow yours?" A specific gesture involving pinched fingers and inhaling motion asked, "Want to hit this?" The nonverbal code let students coordinate use under teachers' noses, developing a secret language around nicotine procurement and consumption. Economic structures emerged around pod distribution that mirrored drug markets. Seniors with fake IDs became suppliers, selling pods at 100% markup to underclassmen. Some students drove to neighbouring states with lax enforcement to buy in bulk. One enterprising teenager in New Jersey reportedly grossed $800 weekly selling individual pods for $10 each. The profit motivated supply chains that ensured even students without direct access could maintain their addictions. Social hierarchies reformed around vaping culture. Students who owned Juuls gained status in certain crowds. Those with connections to reliable pod sources became influential gatekeepers. Flavor preferences signaled group membership. Mango users formed distinct tribes from mint users, with fruit and cucumber users representing smaller factions. The device created new social categories that transcended traditional clique boundaries of jocks, nerds, and popular kids. Juul's early marketing, though claiming to target adults, had planted seeds for this cultural explosion. Launch parties in 2015 and 2016 occurred at trendy nightclubs in Los Angeles, New York, and Miami. The company distributed free devices and pods to attendees who then posted photos to Instagram, tagging Juul's official account. Models at these events looked young, officially over 21, but barely, with aesthetics designed to appeal to aspirational 20-somethings and teenagers who wanted to emulate them. Advertising imagery from 2015-2017 featured people who could plausibly be anywhere from 21 to 35. The fashion was streetwear and athleisure, not the business casual older smokers might wear. Settings included rooftop parties, art galleries, and music venues rather than offices or homes. The tagline, "Satisfaction Guaranteed," alongside sleek product shots, created luxury tech branding that cigarettes could never achieve. The message was clear even if unspoken. Juul made you part of an exclusive, design-conscious, forward-thinking tribe. Color schemes and visual branding borrowed from Apple, Tesla, and premium lifestyle brands. Minimalist packaging in white and grey suggested sophistication. The website featured clean layouts, professional photography, and language about innovation and technology. Nothing about the branding suggested this was a tobacco product trying to help middle-aged addicts quit smoking. Everything suggested this was the iPhone of nicotine delivery, desirable for its own sake. Juul's social media presence, active through 2017, carefully curated content that skirted youth appeal accusations while clearly attracting young followers. Posts showed artistic vapor clouds, close-ups of the device's satisfying click when inserting pods, aesthetic flat-lay photos with Juul surrounded by designer objects. The Instagram account accumulated hundreds of thousands of followers, with comment sections dominated by users posting selfies with their devices, debating flavors, and sharing experiences, many clearly underage based on profile pictures showing high school settings. The company claimed it couldn't control who followed its accounts or what users posted. This technical truth masked operational reality. Social media managers actively liked and commented on user posts, rewarding engagement regardless of the poster's apparent age. They reposted user-generated content featuring young-looking individuals. When influencers with teenage audiences promoted Juul, the company maintained plausible deniability while benefiting from the exposure. Spring 2017 brought an influencer campaign that later triggered investigations. Juul paid social media personalities to promote the device, claiming it recruited only those over 21 with audiences of legal smoking age. But the influencers selected had follower bases that skewed young. Fitness models popular with high school athletes, lifestyle bloggers followed by college-age students, musicians whose fans were predominantly under 25. Posts showed Juul in casual aspirational contexts, at beaches, in cars, during workouts. Affiliate marketing programs incentivized online promotion. The company provided discount codes to influencers who earned commissions on sales. Some influencers made thousands monthly by posting Juul content, creating financial motivation to maximize reach regardless of audience age. The discount codes spread through teen-dominated platforms like Snapchat and Instagram, where age verification was minimal. Students shared codes in group chats, applying discounts to online orders that were shipped with inadequate age checks. Music festival sponsorships and event marketing intensified youth exposure despite official denials. Juul representatives appeared at concerts and festivals where attendees included many under 21. They distributed branded materials, offered device samples to eligible adults, and created photo opportunities with step-and-repeat banners featuring Juul branding. Photos from these events spread across social media, reaching millions of impressionable teenagers who saw their favorite artist fans using the product. The device's design elements facilitated cool factor cultivation. The LED light that glowed when users inhaled created visual interest in photos and videos. The vapor itself photographed beautifully, creating ethereal clouds in good lighting. The satisfying magnetic click when inserting pods generated ASMR-like appeal in videos. Every physical feature seemed optimized for social media documentation, though Juul claimed these were functional design choices, not marketing calculations. Flavor selection drove viral marketing more than any corporate campaign could have. Mango's popularity created genuine enthusiasm that users shared organically. Students posted reviews comparing flavors, ranking preferences, debating which pods were worth the premium price. The flavor discourse generated constant content that kept Juul visible in social feeds without paid promotion. Discontinuing tobacco-flavored pods would have killed word-of-mouth marketing. Fruit and dessert flavors sustained it. Celebrity sightings amplified cultural momentum. Paparazzi photos caught young Hollywood stars using Juuls. Reality TV personalities vaped on camera. Models at Fashion Week were photographed with devices. Each sighting reinforced that Juul was what successful, attractive, trend-setting people used. Teenagers absorbed these messages and drew obvious conclusions about what vaping signaled about their own social status and desirability. Meme culture embraced Juul by late 2017. Jokes about addiction spread across Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit. "It's not a Juul room, it's a bathroom," became a popular punchline. Memes showed people choosing Juul over water, sleep, or relationships. The humor normalized dependency, transforming chemical addiction into shared cultural experience that teenagers bonded over. Laughing about withdrawal symptoms made them seem less serious, more relatable, almost desirable as proof of belonging to an in-group. School parking lots became vaping zones during lunch and after school. Groups of students gathered around cars, passing devices, socializing in clouds of fruit-scented vapor. The ritual replaced smoking areas from previous generations, but happened with younger participants and stronger chemical dependencies. Teachers monitoring parking lots often didn't recognize what they were witnessing. Just students standing around cars, no cigarettes visible, no obvious policy violations to address. The cool factor even infected athletes who should have been most concerned about lung function. High school football players vaped in locker rooms before games. Basketball players hit Juuls during halftime. Track athletes justified use as less harmful than cigarettes, ignoring that they'd never have smoked cigarettes in the first place. Nicotine stimulant effects provided perceived performance benefits, though research showed cardiovascular impairment from vaping reduced athletic capacity over time. Academic performance correlations emerged but were ignored or dismissed. Students who vaped regularly showed decreased focus and lower grades compared to non-users, even controlling for other factors. The cognitive impairment from nicotine withdrawal during school hours, combined with disrupted sleep from evening and nighttime use, created measurable academic consequences. But the cool factor outweighed scholarly concerns. Appearing sophisticated and part of the in-group mattered more than test scores to addiction-vulnerable teenage brains. Juul achieved what tobacco companies had spent a century perfecting, making addiction desirable. The difference was speed and scale. Cigarette culture took decades to establish, relied on massive advertising spending, and peaked before health consequences became undeniable. Juul culture exploded in under 2 years, cost almost nothing in direct advertising, and hooked teenagers before parents, educators, or regulators recognized what was happening. By the time mainstream awareness arrived, millions of adolescents were already chemically dependent on a device that didn't exist 3 years earlier. The cool factor had facilitated the fastest youth drug epidemic in modern history, all while the company maintained it was simply helping adult smokers quit. The National Youth Tobacco Survey results hit FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb's desk in early 2018 like a bomb with documented casualties. High school vaping rates had increased 78% in a single year, from 11.7% in 2017 to 20.8% in 2018. Over 3 million high school students were now current e-cigarette users. Middle school rates jumped from 3.3% to 4.9%, representing 500,000 children aged 11-14 using nicotine regularly. The numbers reversed 2 decades of steadily declining youth tobacco use. Gottlieb recognized what he was reading represented a public health catastrophe in real time. A pediatrician by training, he understood adolescent brain development and the permanence of early nicotine addiction. These weren't adults making informed risk decisions. These were children whose prefrontal cortices wouldn't fully develop for another decade, now chemically dependent on a substance that would reshape their neural architecture permanently. The FDA convened emergency meetings in March 2018 to address what Gottlieb publicly called an epidemic. That word choice was deliberate and unprecedented. The agency had never used epidemic terminology for a commercial product. The declaration signaled that regulatory response would be aggressive and swift. Juul's legal grey area was closing. The company that had operated with minimal oversight for 3 years suddenly faced the full attention of federal regulators. Schools reported infrastructure crises by spring 2018. Bathrooms required monitoring between every class period. Some districts hired additional staff specifically for vaping enforcement. Metal detectors expanded to search for electronic devices, not just weapons. One school in Connecticut locked all bathrooms except one per floor, creating bathroom lines that interfered with class schedules. Another in Ohio installed $2,000 sensors in every restroom, spending over $30,000 on detection systems. Principals described discovering entire social networks built around vaping. Students had created encrypted messaging apps to coordinate pod purchases. They developed elaborate schemes to receive mail-order shipments at school addresses, hiding packages in friends' lockers. Some paid younger students to retrieve devices confiscated by administrators from unlocked storage areas. The ingenuity applied to maintaining nicotine access would have been impressive if it weren't so disturbing. Academic researchers at Stanford, the same university where Juul was conceived, published devastating findings in May 2018. Their analysis showed Juul's nicotine delivery matched or exceeded Marlboro Red cigarettes in both speed and peak blood plasma concentration. The study demolished any remaining argument that e-cigarettes delivered nicotine differently than combustible tobacco. Juul users absorbed nicotine as quickly as cigarette smokers, meaning addiction potential was equivalent despite the absence of combustion. The research revealed something more alarming. Satisfaction ratings among Juul users exceeded those of premium cigarette brands. Users reported higher enjoyment, greater urge reduction, and stronger intention to continue use compared to people smoking Marlboros. The flavor variety, smooth delivery, and social acceptability made Juul more addictive in practical terms than the cigarettes it claimed to replace. The harm reduction argument collapsed under empirical analysis. Parents began recognizing symptoms of nicotine addiction in their children through spring and summer 2018. Teenagers became irritable when unable to access devices. Some experienced physical symptoms, headaches, nausea, difficulty concentrating between uses. One mother in Michigan described her 16-year-old son waking at 3 a.m. to vape because he couldn't sleep without nicotine. Another in Texas found her daughter hiding in the garage multiple times nightly to use a device she'd supposedly thrown away. Pediatricians reported examining patients showing classic addiction behaviors. 14-year-olds admitted consuming multiple pods daily. 15-year-olds described failed quit attempts and relapse within hours. 16-year-olds acknowledged that vaping controlled their daily schedules, determining when they went to bathrooms, when they could concentrate, when they felt normal. The medical professionals were witnessing dependencies that typically took years to establish in adult smokers developing in teenagers within months. The Surgeon General issued a rare advisory in December 2018 specifically addressing youth e-cigarette use. The 37-page report detailed neurological dangers of adolescent nicotine exposure, documented the epidemic's scope, and called for immediate action from parents, educators, healthcare providers, and policymakers. The advisory was only the third issued in the office's history focused on tobacco products. The language was unusually blunt, calling youth e-cigarette use a public health emergency. Truth Initiative, the non-profit created from tobacco industry settlements to prevent youth smoking, completely pivoted its mission in 2018. The organization that had spent 2 decades combating cigarettes now focused almost exclusively on vaping. Their research showed that among young e-cigarette users, 63% didn't realize Juul always contained nicotine. Many teenagers believed they were vaping just flavor, or that nicotine content was optional. The ignorance was both shocking and entirely predictable, given Juul's minimal nicotine warnings on early packaging. Lawsuits began filing nationwide by mid-2018. School districts sued to recover costs of vaping prevention programs, bathroom monitoring, and lost instructional time. The Fairfield County, Connecticut school system filed in May, claiming Juul had deliberately marketed to youth and created a public nuisance requiring millions in mitigation efforts. Other districts from California, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New York followed with similar legal theories. Individual families launched product liability and fraud claims. Parents whose children became addicted alleged that Juul had deliberately concealed addiction risks while marketing to minors. The complaints cited Instagram posts, influencer campaigns, and launch party images as evidence of youth targeting. They pointed to mango and cucumber flavors as specifically designed for adolescent palates. The legal documentation began assembling a damning narrative from Juul's own marketing materials. State attorneys general opened investigations in summer 2018 into whether Juul had violated consumer protection and youth marketing laws. Massachusetts, North Carolina, California, Illinois, and Connecticut led initial inquiries, demanding internal documents related to marketing strategies, sales data by age demographic, and communications regarding youth use. The company initially fought the subpoenas, claiming trade secret protections. Courts rejected those arguments systematically. FDA raids on Juul headquarters in October 2018 seized over 1,000 documents. Agents arrived unannounced at the San Francisco offices, leaving with boxes of marketing materials, sales data, internal emails, and strategy presentations. The surprise inspections signaled that the agency suspected potential violations serious enough to warrant criminal investigation. Company spokespeople claimed full cooperation, while lawyers scrambled to assess exposure. Internal emails released through litigation revealed what executives actually knew. A 2015 message discussed how launch party attendees looked younger than expected. A 2016 sales report noted unexpected strength in high school adjacent retail locations. A 2017 marketing analysis mentioned social media engagement skewing young, but framed this as evidence of reaching 21-24-year-old quitters. The documented awareness was damning. Leadership clearly knew youth were using their product and chose profit over intervention. More explosive were communications showing executives celebrating youth adoption. One sales representative forwarded a news article about high school vaping with the message, "This is great press for us." Another email chain discussed monitoring high school social media to understand flavor preferences. A marketing presentation from 2016 included focus group data from people who self-reported starting nicotine use with Juul, many clearly describing teenage experiences even though paperwork claimed all participants were over 21. Juul's initial public response was performative concern without substantive action. The company announced a youth prevention program in May 2018, consisting of educational materials for schools and $30 million pledged over 3 years to vaping research and prevention. Critics immediately noted this represented less than 2% of annual revenue. The materials themselves drew criticism for emphasizing e-cigarettes were for adults, without explaining addiction risks, essentially advertising while claiming to prevent youth use. The company pulled some flavors from retail stores in November 2018, restricting mango, fruit, cream, and cucumber to online and age-verified retailers only. But the restriction came 3 years after youth adoption had already reached epidemic proportions. Additionally, online age verification was laughably inadequate, simply clicking a checkbox confirming age over 21. Teenagers continued accessing flavored pods easily through online orders or older friends with credit cards. Kevin Burns, Juul's CEO who had replaced one of the founders, gave a disastrous interview in November 2018 where he addressed youth users directly. His scripted message, "Don't vape, don't use Juul," came across as insincere crisis management rather than genuine concern. The awkward delivery and obvious legal coaching made the statement meme-worthy within hours. Teenagers mocked the corporate non-apology while continuing to vape, recognizing performative damage control when they saw it. The interview revealed Burns's perspective that youth use was an unintended consequence, rather than predictable or deliberate outcome. This framing infuriated public health officials who'd been warning about youth nicotine product appeal for years. The FDA, CDC, and numerous researchers had published extensively on how flavors, social media marketing, and sleek designs attracted adolescents. Juul's claimed surprise was implausible, given the extensive literature and their own internal data. Congress summoned Juul executives for testimony in July 2019. Representatives from both parties expressed outrage at marketing practices and dismissive responses to youth addiction. Committee members read from internal documents showing awareness of youth use dating back to 2015. They questioned why the company took no meaningful action until 2018 despite 3 years of epidemic growth. Executives deflected, blamed retailers, insisted they'd always intended to serve adult smokers exclusively. The most damaging moment came when representatives displayed Juul's early Instagram posts alongside images of teenage users' accounts featuring the same aesthetics, hashtags, and behaviors. The visual comparison made youth targeting undeniable. Company posts and user posts were indistinguishable in style, setting, and implied age. Executives claimed they couldn't control user-generated content, which was technically true but strategically meaningless given they'd created the template users copied. California's Attorney General announced in September 2019 that the state was suing Juul for violating consumer protection laws through deliberately targeting minors. The complaint ran over 100 pages, documenting marketing history, internal communications, and sales patterns proving youth targeting. Other states quickly joined with similar complaints. By year's end, over 40 states were investigating or suing the company. The legal exposure reached potentially billions in settlements, not including private lawsuits from individuals and school districts. Juul's valuation, which had peaked at $38 billion in late 2018 following Altria's investment, began collapsing through 2019 as the reckoning intensified. The company laid off hundreds of employees. International expansion plans were cancelled. The founders largely withdrew from public roles. Burns would resign by September 2019, replaced by an Altria executive. The final irony being that Big Tobacco now directly controlled the company that claimed to be replacing cigarettes. The epidemic had been recognized, documented, and condemned. But recognition came after millions of teenagers were already addicted. Schools were already overwhelmed. Parents were already fighting their children's nicotine dependencies. The public health establishment was already scrambling to reverse damage that had accumulated faster than any regulatory response could prevent. The reckoning had begun, but it was 3 years too late to prevent the crisis it now attempted to address. December 20th, 2010, Altria Group, parent company of Philip Morris USA and manufacturer of Marlboro cigarettes, announced a $12.8 billion investment for 35% of Juul Labs. The deal valued Juul at $38 billion, making it worth more than Target, Delta Airlines, or Kellogg. Two Stanford design students who'd started with garage prototypes 9 years earlier were now running one of America's most valuable private companies. More importantly, they were now in business with the exact entity they'd claimed to be disrupting. The investment represented Big Tobacco's most brazen move in decades. Altria had watched cigarette sales decline steadily since the 1990s as litigation, regulation, and public awareness eroded their customer base. Juul offered something cigarettes never could again: growth. Youth adoption created millions of new nicotine users who might never have smoked. The epidemic was bad for public health, but extraordinary for shareholder returns. Altria's CEO at the time framed the investment as harm reduction, helping adult smokers transition to less harmful alternatives. The company pledged to leverage its retail relationships to expand Juul's availability, while supposedly improving age verification. But Altria's history told a different story. Internal tobacco industry documents released through litigation had shown decades of deliberate youth marketing, addiction research concealment, and manipulation of nicotine delivery to maximize dependency. Philip Morris scientists had invented many of the techniques Juul used: ammonia chemistry to enhance nicotine absorption, flavor additives to mask harshness, pH manipulation to smooth delivery. The tobacco giants had employed addiction psychologists, neurologists, and behavioral scientists throughout the 1970s, 1990s to optimize cigarette addictiveness. Now that institutional knowledge transferred to e-cigarettes through corporate ownership, the investment fundamentally changed Juul's trajectory and credibility. A company that positioned itself as a public health innovator had sold more than a third of itself to an organization that had killed millions through deliberate deception. The hypocrisy was suffocating. Public health advocates who'd cautiously supported vaping as harm reduction for adult smokers immediately reversed positions. The medical establishment that had considered e-cigarettes a potentially useful cessation tool now viewed them as tobacco industry Trojan horses. Financial details of the deal revealed additional concerns. Juul distributed $2 billion to employees as a special bonus shortly after the Altria investment closed. This meant many employees, from executives to engineers to marketers, received life-changing windfalls right as the youth epidemic was being documented. Kevin Burns personally received over $20 million. Adam Bowen and James Monses each made approximately $1 billion. They were now billionaires from creating youth nicotine addiction, regardless of their stated intentions. The timing couldn't have been worse for public perception. The FDA had just raided Juul's offices in October 2018. Multiple state attorneys general had opened investigations, congressional hearings were scheduled, and at this moment of maximum scrutiny, Juul partnered with the company that epitomized corporate malfeasance in public health. The deal suggested that making billions mattered more than the public health mission the founders had spent a decade claiming to pursue. Altria immediately leveraged its retail power to expand Juul's presence. The company controlled shelf space and relationships with over 200,000 retail locations nationwide. Within weeks of the investment, Juul products appeared in stores that had never carried e-cigarettes. Gas stations in rural areas suddenly stocked full flavor selections. Convenience stores near schools received priority shipments. The distribution network that had made Marlboro America's best-selling cigarette now served Juul. Wall Street analysts celebrated the deal as strategic brilliance. Altria's stock initially jumped on news of the investment. Juul gained financial resources, regulatory expertise, and distribution infrastructure that would have taken years to build independently. But the strategic benefits were exactly what made the partnership dangerous from a public health perspective. The tobacco industry's core competency was creating and maintaining nicotine addiction across generations. That expertise now applied to devices that had already hooked millions of teenagers. Former FDA officials condemned the investment publicly. Scott Gottlieb, still serving as commissioner, called it concerning, given the youth epidemic. David Kessler, who'd led the FDA during major tobacco battles in the 1990s, said the deal proved that Juul had never been about harm reduction. It was always about profit. Matthew Myers of the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids declared that Juul has joined forces with the very companies it claimed to be trying to put out of business. International markets viewed the Altria deal as confirmation of suspicions about Juul's true nature. The UK had maintained skepticism about American e-cigarette marketing practices, preferring tighter regulations on nicotine concentrations and advertising. Canada accelerated plans to ban flavoured vaping products. The European Union investigated whether existing regulations were sufficient, given the aggressive growth strategies now backed by tobacco industry capital. Internal reorganisation following the investment revealed Altria's influence on operations. Juul's board expanded to include Altria executives with deep tobacco backgrounds. Strategy meetings now included people who'd spent careers marketing Marlboro. The harm reduction messaging started being crafted by communications professionals who'd previously defended cigarette companies in court. The transformation from Silicon Valley startup to tobacco subsidiary happened within months. Meanwhile, a separate health crisis was emerging that would temporarily overshadow the nicotine epidemic, but ultimately make it worse. Starting in summer 2019, emergency rooms across the country began receiving patients with mysterious severe respiratory symptoms. Young people, teenagers and 20-somethings, arrived with coughing, chest pain, difficulty breathing, and rapid progression to respiratory failure requiring intubation. Doctors had never seen anything like it. The CDC launched investigations in July 2019 as cases accumulated. Initial reports came from Wisconsin and Illinois, but within weeks, every state reported cases. The common factor was recent vaping. Media coverage exploded with headlines about vaping deaths and e-cigarette lung disease. By September, the mysterious illness had a name, EVALI, for e-cigarette or vaping product use-associated lung injury. Over 2,800 cases required hospitalization. 68 people died. Public panic conflated nicotine vaping with the EVALI outbreak, despite emerging evidence suggesting different causes. Most EVALI patients had used THC vaping products, specifically black market cartridges containing vitamin E acetate as a cutting agent. The chemical, safe in supplements but toxic when inhaled, caused severe lung inflammation. Nicotine e-cigarettes like Juul were largely not implicated in EVALI cases based on epidemiological analysis. but the distinction didn't matter in public consciousness. Vaping became synonymous with death and lung disease in news coverage through late 2019. Sales of all e-cigarettes plummeted. Parents who'd been unaware of their children's nicotine use suddenly became hypervigilant. Schools intensified enforcement. The health panic, though technically unrelated to Juul's nicotine products, created the political environment for aggressive regulatory action that had been building anyway. Juul faced a crisis of association. Their product wasn't causing EVALI, but they were suffering the reputational consequences. The company issued statements trying to distinguish nicotine vaping from THC products, but the messaging sounded defensive and self-serving. Public health officials warned against all vaping regardless of content. The FDA advised that people who didn't currently vape shouldn't start, completely abandoning any pretense that e-cigarettes served as smoking cessation tools. Kevin Burns resigned as CEO in September 2019, replaced by Casey Crosthwaite, an Altria executive with 25 years of tobacco industry experience. The move signaled complete surrender of any remaining independence or public health credibility. A company founded by Stanford designers to help smokers quit was now run by a big tobacco veteran whose career was built selling combustible cigarettes. The transformation from Silicon Valley startup to tobacco subsidiary was complete. Crosthwaite's appointment demonstrated what the Altria investment really meant. The $12.8 billion wasn't just passive ownership, it was a takeover. Strategic decisions would now be made by executives whose primary loyalty was to Altria shareholders, not public health outcomes. The harm reduction narrative that Bowen and Monsees had genuinely believed in, or at least genuinely articulated, was now just marketing language deployed by professional tobacco industry communicators. Mass layoffs followed throughout late 2019. Juul eliminated 650 positions, roughly 16% of its workforce. Marketing teams were gutted. International expansion groups were disbanded. The company that had been growing exponentially just a year earlier was now in retreat. The firings came just months after employees received million-dollar bonuses from the Altria deal, creating bizarre situations where people were made billionaires and unemployed within the same calendar year. Product restrictions intensified under regulatory pressure. In November 2019, Juul announced it would stop selling mint pods, the last remaining flavored option besides tobacco and menthol in retail stores. Research had shown that after mango's restriction, youth users had largely switched to mint rather than quit. The flavor ban aimed to eliminate this substitution, though critics noted tobacco and menthol remained available, despite being the dominant flavors among adult smokers, and therefore the most logical options for legitimate smoking cessation. The flavor eliminations destroyed Juul's youth appeal, but also undermined the harm reduction argument for adults. Smokers trying to quit often needed flavors different from tobacco to break psychological associations with smoking. Forcing adult users back to tobacco and menthol flavors, the exact profiles of combustible cigarettes, increased likelihood of relapse to smoking. Public health experts were divided. Some saw flavor bans as necessary to combat youth use. Others worried about pushing adult users back to more harmful cigarettes. Foreign governments moved decisively against Juul throughout 2019 and 2020. India banned e-cigarettes entirely in September 2019, citing youth epidemic concerns. China imposed strict regulations despite being the world's largest tobacco market and manufacturing source for most vaping devices. Thailand made possession a criminal offence. Countries that had initially viewed e-cigarettes as promising harm, reduction tools were now treating them as dangerous drug delivery systems requiring prohibition. Altria wrote down the value of its Juul investment by $4.5 billion in the fourth quarter of 2019, admitting the company was worth far less than the $38 billion valuation just a year earlier. The write-down represented one of the worst corporate investments in recent history. Altria's stock suffered. Shareholders sued over the reckless expenditure. The tobacco giant had paid billions for a company whose core product was collapsing under regulatory and legal assault. But Altria's pain was nothing compared to the millions of teenagers now chemically dependent on nicotine who wouldn't have been without Juul. The company that claimed to help smokers quit had instead created a new generation of addicts. Big Tobacco's investment had legitimized and expanded an epidemic that reversed decades of public health progress. The irony was perfect and horrific. The cigarette makers who'd been slowly dying as smoking declined had found renewal by backing a device that addicted children more efficiently than Marlboro ever had. The founders who'd started in a Stanford workshop trying to save their professors' lives had ended up enriching the exact corporations responsible for these deaths, while creating millions of new nicotine addicts in the process. Massachusetts struck first in November 2019, implementing the most aggressive state-level vaping ban in America. Governor Charlie Baker signed emergency legislation prohibiting all flavored tobacco products, including menthol cigarettes and all e-cigarettes regardless of flavor. The 4-month temporary ban aimed to address what the governor called a public health emergency, while permanent regulations were crafted. Retailers had days to remove products from shelves or face penalties. The vaping industry sued immediately, arguing that emergency powers were being abused for non-emergency situations and that the ban violated Commerce Clause protections. Federal courts issued temporary injunctions, creating legal chaos where some provisions applied while others were blocked. Massachusetts smokers and vapers drove to New Hampshire and Rhode Island to purchase products now illegal at home. Black markets emerged within weeks as banned products commanded premium prices. San Francisco voters approved Proposition E in June 2019 by 68% margin, banning all e-cigarette sales until the FDA completed health reviews, essentially an indefinite prohibition since FDA reviews were years behind. The irony was geographically perfect. Juul's headquarters sat in a city that had outlawed its products. Employees arriving at the office each morning worked in a building surrounded by jurisdiction that made their device illegal to sell. The company challenged the ban in court and lost repeatedly. Other municipalities followed San Francisco's lead through late 2019 and early 2020. Chicago banned flavored e-cigarettes within city limits. Minneapolis implemented similar restrictions. Beverly Hills prohibited all tobacco product sales, becoming the first city to ban cigarette sales entirely. The patchwork of local regulations created enforcement nightmares and drove online sales, but the political message was clear. Elected officials at every level were responding to constituent outrage about youth vaping. New York State banned flavored e-cigarettes in September 2019 after Governor Andrew Cuomo declared vaping a public health crisis. The emergency regulations prohibited sales of all flavored vaping products except tobacco flavor. Retailers faced fines up to $2,000 per violation. The state had acted without legislative approval, using executive emergency powers that business groups challenged as overreach. Courts temporarily blocked enforcement while litigation proceeded, creating months of uncertainty. The Trump administration announced federal flavor ban plans in September 2019, with the president himself declaring that vaping had become problematic among youth, and his administration would take action. The proposed rule would remove all non-tobacco flavored e-cigarettes from the market. Juul's remaining mint, mango, and fruit flavors would be eliminated. Only tobacco and potentially menthol would remain available, pending FDA review of whether allowing them would be appropriate for public health. But the federal ban never materialized as announced. Lobbying from vaping industry and some conservative groups convinced the administration to narrow the policy. When final guidance emerged in January 2020, it prohibited fruit and sweet flavors but exempted menthol, the flavour most popular among adult smokers, but also historically used by tobacco companies to target black communities. Critics accused the administration of caving to industry pressure and leaving a major loophole that youth would exploit. The UK maintained a dramatically different approach, creating a natural experiment in regulatory philosophy. British authorities limited nicotine concentrations to 20 ml, roughly 1/3 of Juul's American formula, and restricted advertising while allowing wide flavour availability. Youth vaping rates in the UK remained below 2% among non-smokers, compared to over 20% in the US. The divergent outcome suggested that regulation type mattered enormously, and that America's free market approach had failed catastrophically. British health officials actively promoted vaping as a smoking cessation tool, with the National Health Service recommending e-cigarettes to smokers trying to quit. Studies showed that British smokers who used e-cigarettes were 50–70% more likely to successfully quit compared to those using only willpower or nicotine replacement. The harm reduction argument actually worked in the UK because regulations prevented youth adoption while facilitating adult use. The transatlantic comparison revealed what American policy could have been. Had the FDA imposed nicotine concentration limits early, Juul's addictive formula would never have reached the market. Had marketing restrictions been enforced from the start, social media campaigns couldn't have created the cool factor. Had flavour regulations distinguished between adult-oriented options and kid-friendly candy flavours, mango pods wouldn't have existed. Every regulatory tool that prevented youth epidemic in the UK had been available to American authorities but was deployed too slowly or not at all. Class action lawsuits evolved from dozens to hundreds through 2019 and 2020. Plaintiffs included individual teenagers and young adults addicted to nicotine, parents seeking damages for their children's addictions, school districts demanding reimbursement for prevention costs, Native American tribes addressing epidemic use on reservations, and even prisons reporting widespread contraband vaping. The legal theories range from product liability to fraud to public nuisance. Juul faced potential exposure in the billions. School district lawsuits presented particularly compelling narratives. Fairfield County, Connecticut schools documented spending over $200,000 annually on vaping prevention, bathroom monitors, and educational programs. Districts had installed sensors costing thousands per unit. They'd hired counselors to address addiction. They'd lost instructional time to assemblies and interventions. The financial damages were quantifiable and directly traceable to Juul's marketing decisions and product design. Individual plaintiffs told heartbreaking stories in court filings. A 19-year-old who'd started Juuling at 15 described being unable to quit despite multiple attempts, experiencing severe withdrawal, including anxiety attacks and depression when trying to stop. A mother testified about finding her 14-year-old daughter unconscious from nicotine poisoning after consuming an entire pod trying to impress friends. A high school athlete described losing a college scholarship opportunity after vaping damaged his lung capacity. The human consequences were devastating and well documented. State attorneys' general investigations intensified through 2019, with subpoenas demanding years of internal documents. Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey led the most aggressive inquiry, eventually filing a lawsuit in February 2020 with evidence that Juul had specifically targeted youth. The 100-page complaint included internal documents showing executives knew teenagers were using the product as early as 2015, but took no meaningful action until 2018. Email chains revealed marketing strategies designed to appeal to young people despite public statements to the contrary. North Carolina's Attorney General filed similar charges, emphasizing Juul's presence in schools and deliberate marketing through social media influencers whose audiences were predominantly under 21. The complaint detailed how the company paid influencers with large teen followings, tracked engagement metrics showing majority underage audiences, and continued campaigns despite knowing the demographic reality. The evidence showed not negligence but calculated strategy. California's lawsuit included testimony from former Juul employees describing a corporate culture that celebrated youth adoption privately while denying it publicly. One former marketing director described strategy meetings where executives discussed high school trends and student preferences. Another testified about data showing that most online orders came from people under 25 despite age verification requirements. The insider accounts were damning and difficult for Juul to refute. Juul's legal strategy involved settling cases to avoid jury trials that might generate massive judgments and create precedent. The company began negotiating with state attorneys general in 2020, offering hundreds of millions in settlements, combined with marketing restrictions and financial support for prevention programs. Critics argued the settlements amounted to blood money that didn't address the ongoing epidemic or hold executives personally accountable. The FDA moved toward a comprehensive review of all e-cigarette products in 2020, requiring manufacturers to submit applications proving their devices were appropriate for the protection of public health. The standard was deliberately vague but generally interpreted to mean demonstrating that adult smoking cessation benefits outweighed youth initiation risks. For Juul, this calculation was damning. The company had created far more young nicotine users than it had helped adult smokers quit. Juul submitted its FDA application in July 2020, including data on adult smoking cessation, technical specifications of the device, chemical analysis of vapor, and proposed marketing restrictions. The application ran thousands of pages and reportedly cost over $10 million to prepare. But the company faced a fundamental problem. 3 years of youth epidemic had created a presumption that Juul products were inappropriate for public health protection, regardless of adult benefits. Anti-vaping advocacy groups submitted public comments opposing Juul's application. The American Academy of Pediatrics provided research on adolescent brain development and nicotine's permanent effects. The American Lung Association detailed respiratory concerns. Truth Initiative presented data showing that Juul had reversed decades of declining youth nicotine use. The Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids compiled evidence of deliberate youth marketing. The FDA received over 100,000 public comments, overwhelmingly negative. Meanwhile, Chinese manufacturers exploited the regulatory chaos by flooding the American market with disposable vapes that circumvented flavor bans. Puff Bar, Elf Bar, and dozens of other brands offered high nicotine, intensely flavored products in colorful packaging clearly designed for youth appeal. These devices use the same nicotine salt formula Juul had pioneered but came in flavors like strawberry watermelon, rainbow candy, and cotton candy. Profiles with zero adult smoking cessation justification and obvious kid appeal. The disposable vape explosion revealed that focusing solely on Juul had missed the broader problem. The nicotine salt chemistry was out of the bottle. Other companies simply copied the formula and repeated the marketing strategies that had made Juul successful. By 2021, disposable vapes had captured significant market share, particularly among teenagers who found them even more convenient than pod systems. The epidemic was mutating faster than regulations could adapt. Enforcement proved nearly impossible against manufacturers operating from China with minimal US presence. The companies ignored FDA warning letters. They shipped products through complex supply chains that obscured origin points. They used constantly changing brand names and shell companies to avoid accountability. Customs officials couldn't inspect every package, and domestic retailers profited from selling products in high demand regardless of legality. Political divisions emerged around vaping policy, with conservatives generally opposing bans as government overreach and liberals supporting aggressive regulation to protect children. The partisan split complicated federal action and prevented comprehensive legislation. Some Republicans argued that adult rights to access tobacco alternatives shouldn't be eliminated because of youth misuse. Some Democrats worried that bans would create black markets or push adult users back to cigarettes. Public health experts found themselves divided between harm reduction advocates who emphasized adult smoking cessation and youth prevention specialists who viewed any nicotine product availability as unacceptable given epidemic rates of teen use. The split created messaging confusion and prevented unified advocacy. Some researchers insisted that e-cigarettes saved lives by helping smokers quit. Others maintained that youth addiction costs outweighed any adult benefits. Both positions had empirical support. The policy paralysis allowed the epidemic to continue evolving. Flavored products remained available online despite restrictions in some jurisdictions. Black markets emerged where regulations were tightest. Disposable vapes replaced pod systems as the device of choice among teenagers. The regulatory game of whack-a-mole continued while millions of young people remained addicted to nicotine delivered through devices that existed in legal grey zones, subject to complex jurisdictional patchworks that nobody, including manufacturers, retailers and users, could reliably navigate or understand. The counterattack had been launched across multiple fronts, but the epidemic continued spreading faster than policy could contain it. Neuroscience research published between 2019 and 2021 revealed why Juul had been so catastrophically effective at addicting teenagers. The adolescent brain operates fundamentally differently than adult brains in ways that make nicotine exposure during development permanently damaging. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, decision-making and future planning, doesn't fully mature until age 25. Introducing addictive substances during this critical developmental window doesn't just create dependency, it rewires neural architecture in ways that become permanent. Brain imaging studies from Yale and Duke universities showed structural changes in teenage vapers compared to non-using peers. The nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center, showed heightened activation in response to nicotine cues after just weeks of regular use. More disturbingly, these same brain regions showed blunted responses to natural rewards like food, social interaction, and achievement. The teenage brain was being taught that nicotine was more important than survival activities. Dopamine receptor density increased dramatically in adolescent brains exposed to nicotine compared to adult brains receiving equivalent doses. This meant teenage users developed more intense cravings and more severe withdrawal symptoms than adult smokers consuming similar amounts. A 16-year-old Juuling one pod daily experienced neurological changes equivalent to a 45-year-old smoking 2 packs of cigarettes daily for years. The compression of addiction timeline was unprecedented. Animal models confirmed what epidemiological studies suggested. Rats exposed to nicotine during adolescence showed permanent changes in risk-taking behavior, impulsivity, and susceptibility to other drug addictions that persisted into adulthood even after nicotine exposure ended. The teenage nicotine exposure created vulnerability to future substance abuse disorders that wouldn't exist otherwise. Juul wasn't just addicting kids to nicotine, it was potentially creating lifelong addiction vulnerability. Withdrawal symptoms in teenage vapers manifested more severely than in adult smokers trying to quit. Adolescent users reported extreme irritability within hours of their last dose. Some described depressive episodes that lasted days when attempting to quit. Physical symptoms included headaches intense enough to interfere with school attendance, nausea, trembling hands, and difficulty regulating body temperature. The withdrawal syndrome resembled opioid discontinuation more than traditional cigarette cessation. School counselors documented behavioral changes that tracked perfectly with nicotine withdrawal timing. Students who couldn't access devices during morning classes became agitated, unfocused, sometimes disruptive. Afternoon behavioral problems decreased after lunch when students had opportunities to vape. Teachers noticed the pattern without initially understanding the cause. Certain students were manageable after breaks, but increasingly difficult as time since last nicotine dose increased. One high school in Oregon implemented a pilot program allowing students to use nicotine patches during the school day, rather than fighting constant bathroom usage for vaping. The program was controversial but revealed the severity of addiction. Students who accepted patches reported that even medical-grade nicotine replacement couldn't satisfy cravings the way Juul could. The smooth, rapid delivery through vaping had created dependencies that traditional cessation tools couldn't address. Cognitive testing showed measurable impairment in teenage vapers compared to non-using peers. Working memory, attention span, and processing speed were all reduced in regular users even when tested during periods of recent nicotine use. The deficits persisted during abstinence and worsened during withdrawal. Students who'd been students before Juul adoption saw grades decline as their brains struggled with executive function tasks while managing constant nicotine craving cycles. The psychological component of addiction proved as powerful as the neurological changes. Vaping became intertwined with stress management, social interaction, and identity formation during critical developmental years. Teenagers reported using Juul to calm anxiety before tests, to feel confident in social situations, to manage boredom during classes. The device became a crutch for emotional regulation that prevented development of healthy coping mechanisms. Sleep disruption emerged as a universal problem among teenage vapers. Nicotine is a stimulant that interferes with sleep architecture, reducing REM sleep and sleep quality, even when users believed they slept normally. Teenage vapers went to bed later, woke more frequently during the night, and experienced less restorative sleep than non-users. Some students woke at 2 or 3 a.m. to vape because nicotine withdrawal disrupted sleep. The resulting chronic sleep deprivation compounded cognitive impairment and emotional dysregulation. Cardiovascular research revealed alarming effects in young users. Vaping caused immediate increases in heart rate and blood pressure that persisted for hours after each use. Regular teenage vapers showed arterial stiffness measurements comparable to middle-aged smokers. Endothelial function, the ability of blood vessels to dilate properly, was impaired in adolescent users after just months of vaping. The cardiovascular damage was developing in 16-year-olds whose arteries should have been pristine. Respiratory function testing showed measurable declines in teenage vapers. Pulmonary function tests revealed reduced lung capacity and impaired gas exchange compared to non-vaping peers. Athletes who vaped showed decreased VO2 max, the measure of maximum oxygen uptake during exercise. One study of high school cross-country runners found that vapers finished races an average of 45 seconds slower than non-vapers at equivalent training levels. The performance impact was quantifiable and directly attributable to vaping. Dental professionals reported epidemic levels of oral health problems in teenage vapers. Nicotine causes vasoconstriction that reduces blood flow to gums, leading to recession and increased infection risk. The propylene glycol in vape liquid created acidic oral environments that promoted tooth decay. Teenagers who'd never had cavities suddenly required multiple fillings. Gum disease normally seen in middle-aged smokers appeared in 17-year-olds who'd been vaping for 2 years. Quit rates among addicted teenagers were abysmal, far worse than smoking cessation rates. Studies attempting to help teenage vapers quit using standard smoking cessation protocols saw success rates under 10% at 6 months. Most participants relapsed within days or weeks despite genuine motivation to quit. The combination of severe withdrawal, peer use normalization, easy access to products, and incomplete brain development created nearly insurmountable barriers to cessation. Nicotine replacement therapy designed for adult smokers proved inadequate for teenage vapers. Patches delivered nicotine too slowly to satisfy cravings created by Juul's rapid delivery. Gum tasted terrible and required constant chewing. Lozenges dissolved slowly and tasted medicinal. None replicated the behavioral ritual or social component of vaping. Teenagers given NRT typically abandoned it within days and returned to vaping or began smoking cigarettes to manage withdrawal. Some healthcare providers prescribe medications like varenicline or bupropion, drugs approved for adult smoking cessation, to desperate teenage patients, but these medications weren't approved for adolescent use and had concerning side effect profiles including depression and suicidal ideation. Parents faced impossible choices between allowing continued vaping or risking psychiatric effects from cessation medications. The treatment options were inadequate for the scale and severity of addiction. Behavioral interventions showed limited effectiveness. Cognitive behavioral therapy helped some motivated teenagers identify triggers and develop coping strategies, but relapse rates remained high. Support groups modeled on alcoholics. Anonymous attracted few teenage participants who didn't want to admit having addiction problems. School-based cessation programs were often ineffective because they required students to abstain in environments where peers were actively using, and peer pressure was strongest. The most successful quit attempts involved complete environment changes. Students who moved to different schools, spent summers away from peer groups, or had highly structured residential treatment sometimes achieved sustained abstinence. But these interventions were expensive, disruptive, and accessible only to families with significant resources. Most teenage vapers remained in the same schools and peer groups, where vaping was normalized, making quit attempts extraordinarily difficult. Criminal justice system became involved as some jurisdictions classified vaping devices as drug paraphernalia. Teenagers were being cited, fined, or required to attend diversion programs for possession of nicotine products. Juvenile courts saw cases. School resource officers issued citations. The criminalization approach was controversial. Public health advocates argued that addiction was a medical problem requiring treatment, not punishment. But frustrated parents and school administrators increasingly supported enforcement, hoping consequences would deter use. Some schools implemented zero-tolerance policies that resulted in suspensions or expulsions for vaping. These harsh consequences often backfired by removing struggling students from educational environments without addressing addiction. Suspended students frequently used their time away from school to vape more freely. Expelled students fell further behind academically, while their nicotine dependencies worsened. The punitive approach created more problems than it solved. Research on Juul users, people who both vaped and smoked cigarettes, revealed the worst possible outcomes. Contrary to the harm reduction theory that e-cigarettes would replace smoking, many teenage vapers eventually added cigarettes to their nicotine consumption. Some found cigarettes easier to obtain when pods were unavailable. Others enjoyed the stronger throat hit and ritual of smoking. The gateway effect that Juul had denied proved real. Studies showed teenagers who vaped were 3 to 4 times more likely to eventually smoke cigarettes compared to non-vaping peers. Longitudinal studies following teenage vapers into young adulthood revealed persistent effects years after initial use. Young adults who'd started vaping as teenagers showed higher rates of depression, anxiety disorders, and attention problems compared to those who'd never used nicotine. The associations remained even after controlling for other substance use and demographic factors. The teenage nicotine exposure appeared to have created lasting mental health vulnerability. Pregnancy outcomes emerged as a concern as the first generation of teenage Juul users reached reproductive age. Nicotine exposure during pregnancy causes reduced fetal growth, preterm birth, and developmental problems. Young women who'd become addicted to nicotine through Juul now face difficult choices when becoming pregnant: continue vaping and risk fetal harm, or endure severe withdrawal that might also stress pregnancies. Many didn't realize they were pregnant until after weeks of continued nicotine exposure had already occurred. The scientific literature accumulated over 5 years painted a picture far worse than the initial public health warnings had suggested. Juul's nicotine salt formula combined with adolescent neurobiology had created a perfect storm of addiction severity. The smooth delivery eliminated natural deterrents. The high concentration established dependency rapidly. The developing teenage brain locked in permanent changes. Millions of young Americans were now dealing with chemical dependencies and neurological alterations that would affect them for decades. The science explained not just why the epidemic happened, but why fixing it would be vastly more difficult than preventing it would have been. The FDA's rejection letter arrived at Juul's headquarters on June 23, 2022, after nearly 2 years of review. The agency denied Juul's application to market its products in the United States, citing insufficient evidence that the benefits to adult smokers outweighed risks of youth addiction. The decision was administrative death. Without FDA authorization, selling e-cigarettes was technically illegal. Juul had 30 days to cease all sales or face enforcement action, including product seizures and criminal prosecution. The company's stock price collapsed in private markets. Juul's valuation, which had peaked at $38 billion in 2018, now stood at roughly $10 billion based on secondary market trading. Altria wrote down another $2.6 billion from its investment, bringing total losses on the Juul bet to over $7 billion. Shareholders filed derivative lawsuits against Altria's board for reckless decision-making. The worst corporate investment in tobacco industry history was now documented in quarterly earnings reports. Juul immediately appealed the FDA decision through administrative review processes while seeking emergency stays in federal court. The company argued that removing its products would force millions of adult former smokers back to combustible cigarettes, creating worse public health outcomes than allowing continued Juul sales. Some scientific evidence supported this claim. Studies showed that complete Juul users had lower biomarkers of harm than cigarette smokers, though higher than non-users. Federal courts granted temporary stays blocking FDA enforcement while litigation proceeded, creating a bizarre legal limbo where Juul products remained on shelves despite being officially rejected for sale. Retailers didn't know whether to stock inventory or clear shelves. Consumers stockpiled pods fearing imminent unavailability. The regulatory uncertainty itself became a public health problem as users panic-bought products that might disappear while avoiding cessation attempts that might become necessary. International markets continued collapsing throughout 2021 and 2022. Canada banned most flavored vaping products and imposed strict nicotine concentration limits. The European Union tightened advertising restrictions and implemented plain packaging requirements similar to cigarette regulations. Australia maintained near-total prohibition, requiring medical prescriptions for nicotine vaping products. New Zealand allowed sales but with extensive restrictions on marketing, flavours and retail locations. South Korea shut down Juul operations entirely after determining the company had violated youth marketing prohibitions. Israel imposed import bans. Thailand arrested tourists for possession of vaping devices, treating them as illegal drug paraphernalia. The global backlash had reduced Juul's international presence to a handful of markets where regulatory enforcement remained weak or where the company maintained legal challenges to restrictions. Juul's workforce shrank from over 4,000 employees at peak to under 500 by mid-2022. The San Francisco headquarters that once buzzed with startup energy became a skeleton operation focused on legal defense and regulatory compliance. Former employees described a demoralized culture where everyone understood the company was essentially over, but litigation and appeals dragged on. Many staffers left for competitors or exited the industry entirely. Casey Crosthwaite, the Altria executive who'd replaced Kevin Burns as CEO, resigned in May 2022. His tenure had been entirely damage control, managing regulatory battles, overseeing layoffs, negotiating settlements. The company that had once been Silicon Valley's darling was now a cautionary tale taught in business schools about regulatory risk and social responsibility. Crosthwaite's departure signaled that even Altria recognized there was no path back to the growth trajectory that had justified the $12.8 billion investment. Settlement negotiations with state attorneys general accelerated through 2022. Juul agreed to pay $438.5 million to 34 states and territories to resolve claims of youth marketing and deceptive practices. The settlement required extensive marketing restrictions, youth access prevention programs, and dissolution of the Juul Labs Foundation that critics had called a public relations vehicle. Additional states continued pursuing separate agreements, with total settlement exposure potentially exceeding $1 billion. The settlement terms went beyond financial payments. Juul agreed never to use cartoon characters, models under 35 years old, or any advertising depicting people in its marketing. The company committed to retail access restrictions, age verification requirements, and funding for prevention programs in schools. Marketing would be limited to print media targeted at smokers over 35, with content focused solely on smoking cessation claims. The restrictions essentially eliminated any ability to grow the customer base. Private lawsuits from individuals and families continued accumulating. By late 2022, over 5,000 personal injury claims had been filed in state and federal courts. Plaintiffs ranged from teenagers who'd become addicted after starting Juul use at 13 or 14, to parents seeking compensation for treatment costs, to school districts demanding reimbursement for prevention programs. The cases were consolidated into multi-district litigation in federal court in California for coordinated pretrial proceedings. Bellwether trials scheduled for 2023 and 2024 would determine Juul's legal strategy going forward. If juries awarded massive damages in early cases, the company would face pressure to settle all claims, potentially costing billions. If Juul won initial trials, the company might fight more cases individually. The outcomes would also affect other vaping manufacturers facing similar litigation. The legal precedents established in Juul cases would shape industry liability for years. Black market products flooded areas where regulations were strictest, creating unintended public health consequences. Counterfeit Juul pods manufactured in China contained unknown chemicals at inconsistent concentrations. Some counterfeit pods had nicotine levels far exceeding genuine products. Others contained no nicotine, just flavored liquid that disappointed addicted users who then consumed more trying to satisfy cravings. Heavy metal contamination appeared in some counterfeit products due to inferior manufacturing processes. Disposable vapes from companies like Puff Bar and Elf Bar captured market share. Juul lost through regulatory restrictions. These devices used identical nicotine salt chemistry, but came in intensely sweet flavors that made Juul's mango seem restrained by comparison. Cotton candy, rainbow candy, strawberry banana. The flavors were designed for youth appeal with no pretense of serving adult smokers. The companies operated from China with minimal US presence, making regulatory enforcement nearly impossible. By 2023, disposable vapes accounted for over 50% of e-cigarette sales in the US, surpassing pod systems like Juul. The disposables were cheaper, more convenient, and available in flavors that pod systems could no longer legally offer in many jurisdictions. Teenagers adapted quickly, shifting from Juul to whatever products remained accessible. The regulatory focus on Juul had missed that the core problem was nicotine salt chemistry, not any specific brand. The FDA struggled to enforce regulations against the flood of unauthorized products. The agency issued warning letters to dozens of manufacturers and retailers, but most ignored them without consequences. Customs officials couldn't inspect every package entering the country. Domestic enforcement was hampered by limited resources and legal challenges. The regulatory system designed for traditional cigarettes proved completely inadequate for the e-cigarette market's complexity and global supply chains. Congressional hearings in 2023 revealed the enforcement gap. FDA officials testified they needed significantly more funding and authority to address the problem. The agency requested power to require manufacturers to register facilities, submit products for approval before entering commerce, and face automatic penalties for violations rather than going through lengthy enforcement proceedings. But Congress remained divided on whether to expand FDA authority or limit it, resulting in legislative paralysis. Former Juul executives Adam Bowen and James Monsies largely disappeared from public view after 2019. Neither gave media interviews or made public statements about the epidemic their device had created. Both had become billionaires from the Altria deal, accumulating wealth that would last generations. Neither faced criminal charges despite evidence of knowledge about youth use dating back to 2015. White-collar prosecution of corporate executives remained rare, particularly when actions could be characterized as negligence rather than intent. Kevin Burns, the CEO during Juul's peak growth years, also avoided prosecution, but lived under the cloud of his unintended consequences interview that had become infamous. His awkward attempt to tell kids not to vape was mocked endlessly on social media. Burns had received over $20 million from the Altria deal before resigning in 2019. He moved to a private equity role outside the tobacco industry, rarely discussing his Juul tenure publicly. Other companies learned the wrong lessons from Juul's trajectory. Some tobacco and pharmaceutical companies abandoned e-cigarette development, viewing the regulatory and legal risks as too high. But Chinese manufacturers saw different lessons: sell through distributors without US presence, manufacture offshore beyond regulatory reach, use constantly changing brand names to avoid accountability, target youth aggressively, while growth is possible before regulations catch up. The Juul blueprint had shown that billions could be made before consequences arrived. Public health officials watched in frustration as the epidemic evolved but didn't end. Youth vaping rates declined slightly from 2019 peaks, but remained dramatically elevated compared to 2015 pre-Juul levels. Approximately 15 to 18% of high school students reported current e-cigarette use through 2022-2023, depending on survey methodology. Millions of teenagers remained nicotine dependent. The epidemic had been recognized, documented, and addressed with regulation and litigation, but the fundamental problem, teenage nicotine addiction delivered through vapor, persisted. The tobacco industry settlement from the 1990s provided a historical parallel. That master settlement agreement had required cigarette manufacturers to pay states $246 billion over 25 years and implement marketing restrictions. Yet smoking continued, just at lower rates. The Juul settlements would likely follow similar patterns: payments, restrictions, continued use at lower prevalence. Complete elimination was impossible once millions were already addicted, and black markets could supply demand no matter what regulations prohibited. Juul's collapse also spawned competitors learning from its mistakes. Some companies positioned themselves as medical devices rather than consumer products, seeking FDA approval as smoking cessation tools. Others remained offshore, accepting regulatory violations as business costs. A few attempted to create genuinely youth-proof products through design and marketing choices, though whether such products could be commercially successful remained unclear. The domino fall continued through 2023 and into 2024. Each regulatory action, legal settlement and market restriction created new problems while solving old ones. Banning flavors pushed users to black markets or cigarettes. Allowing flavors sustained youth adoption. Restricting sales reduced access for adults trying to quit smoking. Keeping products easily available perpetuated teen use. Every policy choice involved trade-offs between adult harm reduction and youth protection. Trade-offs that public health systems were poorly equipped to balance. The final domino was trust. An entire generation had learned that devices marketed as smoking alternatives could be deliberately addictive, that tech companies could prioritize growth over consequences, that regulators would act too slowly to prevent epidemics, that adults would allow children to become addicted for corporate profit. The cynicism this created would shape how young people viewed not just vaping, but all health products, corporate messaging, and regulatory promises. Juul had taught millions of teenagers that they couldn't trust the safety of products marketed to them. That lesson perhaps would last longer than the nicotine addiction itself. The first longitudinal studies tracking teenage Juul users into their 20s began publishing results in 2024, 8 years after the epidemic's beginning. Researchers at Johns Hopkins followed 2,000 adolescents who'd started vaping between ages 14 to 17 and compared them to matched controls who'd never used nicotine. The findings were worse than anticipated. 82% of the vaping cohort remained nicotine-dependent into their mid-20s, despite most expressing desire to quit, and many attempting cessation multiple times. Cardiovascular assessments revealed measurable damage in young adults who'd vaped for 5 to 8 years. Arterial stiffness measurements typically seen in 50-year-old smokers appeared in 23-year-olds who'd started juuling at 15. Echocardiograms showed subtle changes in heart wall thickness suggesting early remodeling. Blood pressure averaged 8 to 10 points higher in former teenage vapers compared to non-users, even after controlling for diet, exercise, and other lifestyle factors. The physiological toll was accumulating in bodies that should have been in peak health. Pulmonary function testing documented persistent lung damage. Forced expiratory volume, the amount of air that can be forcefully exhaled in 1 second, averaged 12% lower in young adult vapers compared to never users. This represented lung capacity loss, typically associated with decades of smoking, achieved in under a decade of vaping. Some subjects showed early signs of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in their early 20s. Respiratory therapists described measuring lung function in 24-year-olds that resembled 60-year-old former smokers. Cancer risks remained uncertain because carcinogenesis typically requires decades of exposure before tumors develop. But the chemical exposures from vaping raised serious concerns. Formaldehyde and acetaldehyde, known carcinogens produced when vape liquid heated, had been inhaled by millions of teenagers for years. Heavy metal particles from heating coils had deposited in lung tissue. Flavoring chemicals with unknown long-term effects had been consumed daily. The cancer outcomes wouldn't be known until the 2030s and 2040s, when today's teenage vapers reached middle age. Reproductive health problems emerged as young adults who'd vaped as teenagers tried to conceive. Male fertility studies showed reduced sperm counts and motility in men with histories of heavy adolescent vaping. Female fertility appeared affected as well, with longer time to pregnancy among women who'd vaped regularly during development. The mechanisms were unclear, but likely involved vascular damage reducing blood flow to reproductive organs and direct toxic effects on developing reproductive systems during puberty. Pregnancy outcomes among young women who'd become addicted as teenagers showed increased risks across multiple measures. Preterm birth rates were elevated by approximately 30% compared to non-users. Birth weights averaged 200 grams lower. NICU admission rates were higher. Some women successfully quit vaping when they learned of pregnancies, but others found nicotine addiction too severe to overcome even with fetal health at stake. The consequences of teenage Juul use were now affecting the next generation. Mental health effects persisted and worsened over time. Depression rates among those who'd vaped as teenagers exceeded comparison groups by 40% in young adulthood. Anxiety disorders were nearly twice as common. ADHD diagnoses requiring medication were more prevalent. Whether nicotine exposure caused these conditions or people predisposed to mental health issues were more likely to become addicted remained unclear, but the associations were consistent across multiple studies after controlling for other variables. Cognitive testing revealed sustained deficits in executive function among young adults who'd vaped during adolescence. Working memory, attention span, and impulse control all showed measurable impairment compared to non-using peers. The deficits weren't severe enough to cause obvious disability, but were sufficient to affect academic performance, job success, and complex decision-making. Some researchers hypothesized that nicotine exposure during critical brain development had prevented full maturation of prefrontal cortex networks. Addiction vulnerability extended beyond nicotine. Young adults who'd vaped as teenagers showed higher rates of alcohol abuse, marijuana dependence, and prescription drug misuse compared to those without teenage nicotine exposure. The gateway hypothesis that had been debated for decades now had empirical support. Early nicotine addiction appeared to create neurological vulnerability to other substance dependencies. Animal models showed similar patterns. Adolescent nicotine exposure in rats, increased later alcohol consumption, and cocaine self-administration. Juul use patterns revealed the worst outcomes. A subset of teenage vapers had eventually added cigarettes to their nicotine consumption, rather than replacing one with the other. These Juul users in their 20s showed biomarkers of harm exceeding either cigarettes or vaping alone. Their lungs showed combined damage from vapor chemicals and combustion products. Cardiovascular measures indicated cumulative insult from two delivery methods. The harm reduction theory had completely failed in this population. Some former teenage vapers had successfully quit by their mid-20s, but the process typically required professional help and multiple attempts. Success stories involved residential treatment programs, prescription medications, and extensive behavioral therapy. Relapses were common and expected. One longitudinal study following quit attempts found that former teenage vapers required an average of 4.7 serious quit attempts before achieving sustained abstinence, higher than the 3.2 attempts needed for adult smokers trying to quit cigarettes. Economic consequences accumulated as the first wave of teenage users entered prime working years. Productivity losses from smoke breaks, now vape breaks, reduced workplace efficiency. Healthcare costs climbed as respiratory and cardiovascular problems required treatment. Some employers began discriminating against vapers in hiring decisions, viewing nicotine dependence as a liability. The individual economic burden of a lifelong nicotine addiction exceeded $50,000 over a lifetime in direct costs and lost productivity. Insurance companies responded by raising premiums for nicotine users, treating vaping identically to smoking for actuarial purposes. Life insurance, health insurance, and disability insurance all cost more for anyone admitting nicotine use on applications. Young adults who'd become addicted as teenagers faced decades of higher insurance premiums starting in their 20s. The financial penalty for adolescent decisions made before brains were fully developed would persist through peak earning years. Educational attainment showed disturbing patterns. College graduation rates were lower among those who'd vaped heavily in high school compared to non-users, even after controlling for socioeconomic factors. The cognitive effects and ongoing addiction interfered with academic success. Some students dropped out specifically because managing nicotine dependency while studying became overwhelming. Graduate school attendance rates were similarly reduced. The addiction contracted as teenagers was limiting lifetime achievement potential. Career trajectories diverged between former teenage vapers and non-users over time. Average income at age 25 was approximately 8% lower for those with adolescent vaping histories after controlling for education and other factors. Job tenure was shorter, suggesting either inability to maintain employment or chronic job hopping. Performance evaluations at work averaged lower ratings. Whether these outcomes reflected cognitive impairment, addiction interference, or selection effects remained debated, but the pattern was consistent. Social consequences included relationship problems stemming from nicotine dependence. Partners of heavy vapers reported frustration with the addiction's control over daily schedules and finances. Some relationships failed specifically over vaping-related conflicts. Parents reported guilt about having been unable to prevent their teenagers' addictions years earlier. Siblings expressed anger at family members whose teenage choices created lifelong health problems, requiring ongoing support. The healthcare system struggled to address the wave of young adults with nicotine dependencies contracted as minors. Addiction medicine programs designed for older adults with smoking histories didn't translate well to 20-somethings who'd never smoked cigarettes. Insurance often didn't cover treatment for conditions stemming from legal product use. Many young people lacked insurance entirely, or had high deductible plans that made treatment financially inaccessible. Cessation medications showed mixed results in this population. Varenicline helped some former teenage vapers quit, but had psychiatric side effect risks that were particularly concerning in young adults with already elevated depression rates. Bupropion was less effective than in older smokers. Nicotine replacement remained inadequate for people whose addictions were established through high-dose nicotine salts. The pharmacological toolkit wasn't designed for this patient population. Behavioral health interventions adapted to young adult needs showed better outcomes. Programs that integrated addiction treatment with career counseling, financial planning, and social support proved more effective than traditional cessation approaches focused solely on quitting. But such comprehensive programs were expensive and rarely covered by insurance. Most young adults trying to quit were left with inadequate resources and high failure rates. Support communities formed online and in person for young adults dealing with nicotine addictions contracted as teenagers. The communities provided space to discuss the unique challenges of being addicted to a substance marketed as a smoking cessation tool, of having started using before understanding addiction risks, of watching peers continue vaping while trying to quit. The peer support helped some achieve abstinence, though others found that addiction recovery communities dominated by older recovering smokers didn't address their specific experiences. Legal liability questions arose as the first wave of health problems manifested. Could young adults sue Juul for addictions and health problems acquired as minors? Statutes of limitations typically ran from age of majority, giving former teenage users until their mid-20s to file claims. Class action lawsuits specific to health outcomes, not just addiction itself, began organizing. Cancer diagnoses in coming years might trigger additional litigation waves as concrete diseases manifested from years of chemical exposure. Public health costs accumulated as the cohort of former teenage vapers aged. Medicaid and Medicare would eventually bear expenses for treating respiratory diseases, cardiovascular problems, and cancers arising from adolescent nicotine exposure. One economic analysis estimated the lifetime healthcare costs of the Juul epidemic at over $50 billion in government spending alone, not counting private insurance or individual out-of-pocket expenses. The fiscal burden would persist for decades. The permanence of consequences became undeniable by 2024-2025. Unlike youthful mistakes that could be outgrown, teenage nicotine addiction through Juul had created lifelong health impairments, ongoing dependencies, and persistent vulnerabilities. The developing brains that had absorbed nicotine salts at 15 were now 25-year-old brains still showing the scars. The lungs that had inhaled vapor daily through high school were now young adult lungs, functioning like middle-aged organs. The choices made by adolescents, influenced by sophisticated marketing, peer pressure, and underdeveloped risk assessment, had determined health trajectories for the next 5 or 6 decades of their lives. The consequences weren't potential or theoretical. They were arriving, documented in medical records and research studies, accumulating in emergency rooms and doctors' offices, manifesting in young bodies that should have been healthy, but instead bore the marks of an epidemic that regulators, parents, and educators had allowed to happen. Adam Bowen and James Monsees disappeared from public life after 2019, their billion-dollar fortunes secured through the Altria deal. Neither granted interviews to journalists investigating the epidemic they'd created. Neither testified in the civil lawsuits filed by thousands of families. Neither appeared at medical conferences discussing the long-term health consequences documented in their former users. The 2 Stanford graduates who'd claimed they wanted to save smokers' lives had become reclusive billionaires associated with creating the largest youth nicotine epidemic in history. Bowen moved to a compound in Northern California, investing in various tech startups through private vehicles that obscured his involvement. Monsees relocated to Europe, reportedly living between London and Switzerland. Both men employed public relations firms that worked to scrub their names from negative coverage and suppress their association with Juul in online searches. Neither made philanthropic donations to addiction treatment or youth health programs, despite having resources that could fund meaningful interventions. Kevin Burns emerged briefly in 2023 for a deposition in civil litigation, where he maintained that youth vaping had been unintended and that Juul had acted responsibly when problems were recognized. His testimony, released publicly, revealed a man still convinced that the company had been primarily a force for good, despite overwhelming evidence of harm. Burns claimed that thousands of adult smokers had quit because of Juul, and that this benefit outweighed the costs of youth addiction. Plaintiffs' attorneys demolished these claims with internal documents and epidemiological data. The documents showed that for every adult who completely switched from cigarettes to Juul, approximately 25 young people who'd never smoked initiated nicotine use through vaping. The public health arithmetic was devastating, even granting maximal credit for adult harm reduction. The youth epidemic created exponentially more nicotine addiction than was prevented. Juul had dramatically increased total nicotine users in America, rather than merely shifting existing users to less harmful delivery. Academic researchers studying the epidemic compared it to OxyContin as a case study in corporate malfeasance disguised as medical innovation. Both products emerge from seemingly legitimate goals, treating pain, helping smokers quit. Both companies deployed sophisticated marketing that reached vulnerable populations. Both created dependencies far exceeding therapeutic need. Both generated billions in profit while creating public health catastrophes. Both resulted in settlements and restrictions only after enormous damage had accumulated. The parallels extended to regulatory failure. The FDA had approved OxyContin based on inadequate long-term studies and industry-funded research minimizing addiction risks. The agency had similarly allowed e-cigarettes to proliferate without rigorous pre-market review. In both cases, regulators moved too slowly, trusted industry claims too readily, and prioritized theoretical adult benefits over documented youth harms. The institutional failures weren't identical but rhymed perfectly. Criminal prosecutions never materialized against Juul executives despite evidence of knowledge about youth use dating to 2015. Federal prosecutors declined to bring cases, citing difficulty proving criminal intent versus negligence. State prosecutors similarly avoided charges. The contrast with opioid prosecutions was stark. Purdue Pharma executives faced criminal consequences, while Juul leadership faced only civil liability. The double standard reflected ongoing reluctance to criminalize white-collar corporate behavior. Civil settlements reached nearly $3 billion by early 2025, when Juul agreed to a comprehensive resolution with all remaining state attorneys general and most private plaintiffs. The company admitted to no wrongdoing, but agreed to sweeping restrictions and financial payments. Juul would essentially cease to exist as a commercial entity, remaining only to manage settlements and wind down operations. The founder's creation had lasted roughly 10 years from initial commercial launch to effective corporate death. Altria's total losses from the Juul investment exceeded $10 billion when accounting for the initial purchase, subsequent write-downs, legal settlement contributions, and lost opportunity costs. The debacle ranked among the worst corporate investments in American business history. Shareholders sued Altria's board for breach of fiduciary duty. The tobacco giant's stock languished as investors questioned management competence. The company that had profited from cigarettes for over a century had been devastated by trying to profit from their supposed replacement. Schools permanently installed vaping detection systems costing millions collectively. The technology used sensors that detected chemical signatures of vapor, triggering alerts when students vaped in bathrooms or classrooms. The systems were expensive, sometimes unreliable, and created surveillance infrastructure that civil libertarians warned could be repurposed for other monitoring. But administrators felt they had no choice, given the epidemic's persistence even after peak years. Educational approaches evolved from prevention to harm reduction. Schools recognized that lecturing students about not vaping was ineffective once millions were already addicted. Programs shifted toward helping addicted students manage cravings during school hours, providing cessation resources, and minimizing academic damage from nicotine dependence. Some districts provided nicotine patches or gum to students whose parents consented, treating addiction as a medical condition requiring management rather than a discipline problem requiring punishment. The cultural shift in how vaping was perceived happened gradually through 2020-2025. What had been cool and trendy in 2017 became increasingly stigmatized as health consequences emerged and regulations tightened. Celebrities photographed vaping faced criticism. Musicians who'd referenced Juul in lyrics moved away from the content. The social media aesthetic that had made vaping seem sophisticated reversed as evidence accumulated about addiction and health damage. Youth vaping rates finally began sustained decline from 2022 onward, as the combined effects of regulation, education, stigmatization, and fear took hold. High school usage dropped from peaks around 27-28% in 2019 to approximately 14-15% by 2024. Middle school rates fell from 11% to 5%. The decreases were significant but still represented millions of young nicotine users, far more than the pre-Juul baseline. The epidemic had been partially controlled but not eliminated. Disposable vapes remained the primary threat as Juul faded from prominence. Chinese manufacturers continued flooding the market with intensely flavored, high-nicotine products that exploited every loophole in American regulations. Elf Bar became the dominant brand by 2024, offering dozens of candy-like flavors despite being unauthorized for sale. The FDA issued warnings and seized shipments, but enforcement remained inadequate against the volume of imports and domestic distribution networks. Some states moved toward comprehensive nicotine product licensing systems similar to alcohol regulation. Applications required demonstrated compliance with youth access prevention, marketing restrictions, and product safety testing. Retailers needed licenses subject to revocation for violations. The approach showed promise but required state-by-state implementation, since federal legislation remained stalled. Patchwork regulation persisted despite clear need for national standards. International examples continued showing that different regulatory approaches yielded dramatically different outcomes. Sweden's permissive attitude towards snus, oral tobacco pouches, had created one of Europe's lowest smoking rates, but also normalised nicotine use among youth. New Zealand's prescription requirement for nicotine vaping kept youth rates low, while helping adult smokers. The UK's balanced approach maintained youth rates under 2% while supporting adult cessation. America's failed regulatory model became a cautionary tale studied worldwide. Public health scholars analysing the Juul epidemic identified multiple points where intervention could have prevented disaster. Had the FDA required pre-market approval before e-cigarettes entered commerce in the early 2010s, addictive products like Juul's nicotine salt formula would have faced rigorous review. Had nicotine concentration limits been imposed when first suggested around 2016, the most addictive formulations would have been prohibited. Had social media marketing been restricted immediately, the cool factor would never have developed. Every failure point was documented with perfect hindsight. The fundamental question that would be debated for decades remained unresolved. Did Bowen and Monsees intend to create youth addiction? Or did they genuinely believe they could market only to adults in the social media age? The truth likely existed somewhere between. Willful blindness in pursuit of unicorn valuations. The founders probably convinced themselves that youth use was regrettable, but not their responsibility. That marketing showing young-looking adults didn't target teenagers. That they couldn't control how people used their product once purchased. This self-deception was documented in internal emails and depositions. Executives expressed surprise at youth adoption, despite data showing retail sales concentrated near schools. Marketing teams created aesthetics obviously appealing to young people while maintaining they targeted adults. Launch parties were held at venues frequented by 20-somethings barely over legal age, with predictable social media reach to teenagers. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. Leadership simultaneously knew and denied what was happening. The legacy Juul left was multifaceted and entirely negative from public health perspectives. The company had reversed 2 decades of declining youth tobacco use, creating millions of nicotine addicts who wouldn't have existed otherwise. It had demonstrated that regulatory systems were too slow to prevent epidemics from sophisticated corporate actors. It had shown that Silicon Valley innovation culture could be as destructive as traditional tobacco industry behavior when applied to addictive substances. It had proven that harm reduction messaging could be weaponized to justify creating new harm. The one arguable positive, helping some adult smokers quit, was overwhelmed by the youth epidemic's magnitude. Even the most generous analysis suggested that adult benefits were dwarfed by adolescent harm. Juul had created vastly more nicotine users than it had helped quit, making its net public health effect clearly negative. The harm reduction argument that had seemed plausible in 2015 was completely demolished by 2025 when all outcomes were measured. Future technological innovations in nicotine delivery would face presumptive hostility because of Juul. Any company proposing new devices would confront skepticism from regulators, opposition from public health groups, and scrutiny from media and legislators. The trust necessary for genuinely beneficial innovations had been destroyed. Whether this was appropriate or excessive would depend on one's interpretation of the Juul story. Cautionary tale about insufficient regulation, or tragedy of well-intentioned innovation corrupted by greed and negligence. The final accounting remained incomplete in 2025. The teenagers who'd started juuling in 2016-2018 were only reaching their late 20s. Cancer diagnoses wouldn't arrive until the 2030s and 2040s. Cardiovascular disease complications would accelerate in the 2040s and 2050s. The full health toll wouldn't be quantifiable until mid-century, when the cohort reached ages where smoking-related diseases typically manifest. The epidemic's body count was still being accumulated. What was certain was that millions of young Americans had been chemically altered by a device that shouldn't have reached market in its most addictive formulation. Their brains had been rewired during critical development. Their cardiovascular systems had been damaged before maturity. Their life expectancies had likely been reduced. Their quality of life had been compromised. All of this happened in less than a decade, from a product invented in a Stanford workshop by two men who claimed they wanted to help people quit smoking. The supreme irony was that the cigarette companies Bowen and Monsees had set out to destroy had instead profited from their creation. Altria, maker of Marlboro, had owned over a third of Juul during its peak. Reynolds American, producer of Camel and Newport, had invested in competing vaping products. British American Tobacco owned Vype. The tobacco giants that had been slowly dying as smoking declined had found renewal through e-cigarettes that created new generations of nicotine addicts. The revolution had been captured by the old regime. The disruptors had become the enablers of the industry they'd claimed to oppose, and millions of teenagers, now young adults, carried the consequences in their lungs, their hearts, their brains, their lives. The Juul epidemic of 2015-2025 represented a complete systems failure across every institution meant to protect public health. Regulatory agencies moved too slowly despite clear warning signs. Schools lacked resources and authority to address addiction on their campuses. Parents remained ignorant until millions of children were already dependent. Medical professionals had no effective treatments for the specific type of dependency Juul created. Lawmakers couldn't overcome partisan divides and lobbying pressure to pass meaningful legislation. Each institutional failure compounded the others, allowing the epidemic to establish itself before coordinated response became possible. By 2026, the immediate crisis had passed, but the consequences were permanent and ongoing. Youth vaping rates had declined from their peaks, but remained elevated compared to the pre-Juul era. Millions of young adults carried nicotine dependencies contracted as minors into their prime working and reproductive years. The healthcare system continued treating respiratory, cardiovascular and psychological problems stemming from adolescent vaping. Criminal justice systems processed cases of illegal sales to minors. Schools maintained expensive detection and prevention infrastructure that diverted resources from education. The financial toll exceeded $100 billion when accounting for healthcare costs, lost productivity, educational disruptions, legal expenses and prevention programs. This figure would grow substantially as the cohort of former teenage vapers aged and developed diseases requiring decades of treatment. Medicaid and Medicare would bear enormous costs from preventable conditions contracted through adolescent nicotine exposure. The fiscal burden represented wealth transfer from taxpayers to shareholders who'd profited from the epidemic's growth phase. Juul itself became a zombie company by 2026, technically operational, but existing primarily to manage legal liabilities and fulfill settlement obligations. The San Francisco office employed fewer than 100 people, mostly lawyers and compliance staff. No new products were being developed. Marketing had ceased entirely. The brand that had been valued at $38 billion in 2018 was essentially worthless by 2026. Whatever remained would be liquidated to pay settlements once all litigation concluded. Adam Bowen and James Monsees retained their billion-dollar fortunes despite their company's collapse. Neither had been required to return money from the Altria sale, despite evidence they'd known about youth adoption for years before acting. Personal liability in civil cases was minimal because corporate structures shielded individual executives. The two men who'd created the epidemic would live comfortably while millions dealt with the health consequences. The injustice was complete and legally protected. Kevin Burns similarly faced no personal financial consequences, despite leading the company during its most aggressive growth phase. The severance package he'd received when resigning in 2019 included tens of millions in compensation. His reputation was damaged, but his wealth was secure. The disconnect between responsibility and accountability was total. The executives who'd overseen the epidemic were billionaires and multimillionaires, while their victims dealt with addiction, disease, and economic hardship. The broader e-cigarette industry adapted to post-Juul reality by fragmenting into multiple niches. Chinese disposable manufacturers continued targeting youth with candy flavors despite regulations. Some companies positioned themselves as medical devices for smoking cessation, pursuing FDA approval through rigorous clinical trials. Others focused on international markets with less restrictive regulations. A few American startups attempted to build genuinely responsible products with youth-proof designs, though commercial viability remained questionable. Tobacco companies that had invested in vaping largely retreated after watching Altria's Juul disaster. Philip Morris focused on heated tobacco products like IQOS that avoided some regulatory issues by not vaporizing liquid. Reynolds scaled back e-cigarette investments. British American Tobacco wrote down vaping ventures. The giants concluded that regulatory and legal risks outweighed growth potential in American markets, though international expansion continued where regulations were friendlier. Public health advocates remained divided on fundamental questions about nicotine harm reduction. Some maintained that any alternative to combustible cigarettes was preferable, and that overly restrictive regulations on vaping would perpetuate smoking. Others argued that creating any nicotine products appealing enough to help smokers quit would inevitably attract youth, making harm reduction impossible. The philosophical split prevented unified messaging and complicated policy formation. Research funding increased dramatically as NIH and other agencies prioritized understanding long-term consequences of vaping. Longitudinal studies tracked former teenage users through their 20s and 30s. Cancer surveillance programs monitored for elevated disease rates. Cardiovascular researchers studied arterial damage progression. Reproductive health specialists examined pregnancy outcomes and fetal effects. The scientific community recognized that the full impact wouldn't be known for decades, but that current data collection would be essential for future understanding. International cooperation on vaping regulation improved after the American epidemic became a cautionary tale. WHO developed global guidelines for e-cigarette control. Countries shared enforcement strategies and regulatory approaches. The consensus shifted toward treating vaping products as tobacco, regardless of whether they contained actual tobacco leaf. The American experience convinced international health authorities that strong regulation from the beginning was essential. Permissive approaches inevitably led to youth epidemics. Criminal organizations expanded involvement in vaping black markets as regulations tightened. Cartels that traditionally profited from cigarette smuggling added counterfeit and unauthorized vaping products to their portfolios. The profit margins were extraordinary. Disposable vapes manufactured for $2 in China sold for $20 retail, with criminal markups adding further revenue. Organized crime recognized that vaping products offered drug-level profits with lower legal risks than traditional narcotics. Technology continued evolving in ways that made enforcement increasingly difficult. 3D printing allowed manufacturing of device components domestically. Cryptocurrency enabled untraceable online transactions. Encrypted messaging apps facilitated distribution networks. The cat-and-mouse game between regulators and manufacturers accelerated, with each side deploying more sophisticated tools. The regulatory infrastructure built for 20th century tobacco products proved inadequate for 21st century nicotine delivery systems. Political momentum for addressing youth vaping faded by 2025-2026 as media attention moved to other crises. The immediate epidemic's peak had passed, making continued aggressive action less urgent to legislators. Industry lobbying intensified as companies argued that sufficient regulations existed and that further restrictions would harm adult smokers trying to quit. The political will necessary for comprehensive federal action never materialized beyond piecemeal measures. Social media companies faced minimal consequences for their roles in spreading vaping culture, despite platforms having facilitated youth marketing through influencers and viral content. Congressional hearings included questions about algorithm promotion of vaping content to minors, but no legislation resulted. Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Snapchat implemented policies restricting vaping content, but enforcement was inconsistent. The platforms that had enabled the epidemic's social spread faced no legal or financial accountability. Parents whose children became addicted organized advocacy groups demanding accountability and resources. Some groups focused on litigation support, helping families join class actions against Juul. Others pushed for legislative change at state and federal levels. A few created cessation programs specifically designed for young adults, dealing with dependencies contracted as minors. The grassroots organizing represented one positive outcome: communities mobilizing to address problems that institutions had allowed to develop. Schools developed institutional knowledge about managing nicotine addiction that hadn't existed before the epidemic. Administrators learned detection strategies, intervention protocols, and resource allocation for prevention. The expertise was hard-won through years of crisis management. Whether this knowledge would be useful in preventing future epidemics of different substances remained uncertain, but the institutional capacity had been built through painful experience. Juul's story was increasingly taught in business schools, public health programs, and ethics courses as a case study in corporate responsibility failure. Students analyzed decision points where leadership could have chosen differently. They examined the tension between profit maximization and social good. They debated whether the founders were villains, naive idealists, or something between. The epidemic became educational material, though this was cold comfort to those living with its consequences. The fundamental question that the Juul epidemic raised remained unresolved. Could capitalism and public health coexist when dealing with addictive substances? The tobacco experience suggested not. Companies selling addiction couldn't be trusted to voluntarily limit markets, restrain marketing, or prioritize health over profit. Yet the same economic system had produced vaccines, life-saving medications, and health innovations. The Juul case study provided no clear answers, only more evidence of how badly things could go wrong when regulatory oversight failed. Future historians would likely view the Juul epidemic as preventable tragedy, a crisis where every warning sign was visible, every intervention point was identified, and every necessary action was available but not taken until after millions were harmed. The story would join other American public health failures, the Tuskegee experiment, the opioid crisis, the contaminated water in Flint. Each represented systems breakdown where institutional priorities superseded human welfare until damage became undeniable. The teenagers who'd started juuling in 2016 were only 30 years old in 2026. Their life expectancies stretched potentially into the 2070s and 2080s. They would carry nicotine dependencies and health consequences for another 5 decades. Their children might suffer effects of in utero nicotine exposure. Their healthcare would cost millions collectively. Their lost productivity would amount to billions. And somewhere, The founders who'd created the device responsible for this suffering lived comfortable lives, insulated by wealth from the consequences of their creation. The story wasn't finished. Cancer diagnoses would arrive in the 2030s. Cardiovascular disease would accelerate in the 2040s. Chronic respiratory conditions would worsen throughout the 2050s and beyond. Each decade would bring new research documenting additional harms. Lawsuits would continue for years as new damages manifested. The full accounting of the Juul epidemic wouldn't be possible until the cohort of users reached old age or death, whichever came first. What was certain in 2026 was that 2 Stanford design students had set out to disrupt the tobacco industry and save lives, and instead had created one of the fastest spreading youth drug epidemics in American history. Their device had addicted millions of children to nicotine who never would have smoked cigarettes. Their company had reversed decades of public health progress. Their innovation had demonstrated that harm reduction could be weaponized into harm creation with sufficient marketing sophistication and regulatory failure. The promise had been salvation. The delivery had been catastrophe. And the reckoning would continue for generations.